Arya Stark stood in the great hall of Winterfell with her hands curled at her sides, the cool stones beneath her feet seeming to hum with the weight of all she was about to sacrifice. The ravens had flown in the week before, bearing news she had never expected. King Aegon Targaryen, rumored to be Rhaegar's long-lost son returned from exile, had seized the Iron Throne and was petitioning the North for unity. A strategic alliance was proposed. No, demanded really by the new monarch. A marriage to bind the North and the Crown so tightly that no wedge could ever be driven between them again. Sansa had read the letter aloud, her voice echoing beneath Winterfell's vaulted ceilings. The words had reverberated around the feasting hall, mingling with the scent of roasted meat and pine resin. It had seemed so impossible, so surreal. And then Sansa had turned to her sister with an expression of reluctant resignation. They all knew Arya was the only available Stark left of an age and station that would appeal to a king seeking legitimacy. Where once they might have forced Sansa into such a union, she was now Lady of Winterfell in her own right, betrothed to an honorable Lord of the North for the sake of consolidation. There was no one else. The realm demanded a Stark bride, and Arya was the only choice. She had never imagined she would stand in her father's castle, the same place where she had once shot arrows at straw targets and scampered through the gods' wood in boy's breeches, and agree to marry a king. The entire concept seemed ridiculous, a joke at the expense of the litany of lords who had mocked her as a girl. Arya the Horseface, the girl who hated dresses and courtesy and needlework, who dreamed of water dancing and sword fights, now being fitted for royal gowns. But the war had changed her. Death had changed her, the faces she wore, the names she borrowed, the shapes that lingered in her nightmares, and the memories of blood that she carried like old scars, had transformed her into someone who could consider an offer like this, and, more importantly, use it to her advantage. Or so she had told Sansa and Bran. The words had not come easily. Marrying for strategy was something Sansa might have done, but Arya? And yet, the crown's trust was not easily earned. If the North was to remain safe from any new tyranny, an insider's vigilance was vital. Arya would be that insider. She would accept a marriage not born of love but of a cunning and necessary alliance. She would hold the North's best interests in her hands, even if it meant chaining herself to the Targaryen line. And she would make sure that the new king, whoever he truly was beneath that silver banner, would not forget that a wolf still had teeth. They traveled south with a modest retinue. Sansa offered to send hundreds of bannermen, but Arya refused, sensing that an ostentatious display of northern strength would make the crown's lords edgy. Instead, she picked a small party of trusted guards and companions. Brienne came for a time, partway, to ensure she reached the outskirts of the Crownlands safely, but then turned back on Sansa's command, for the Lady of Winterfell could ill afford to lose her sworn shield for too long. The journey was unremarkable. Long stretches of dusty roads, small folk who stopped and stared as the northern entourage passed, wearing the dire wolf sigil proudly. Arya rode at the front with her chin held high, dressed in leathers for travel, looking for all the world like some fierce soldier rather than a princess on her way to be wed. Secretly, she welcomed the uneasy quiet of the roads. She had missed the great expanses of the Seven Kingdoms, had forgotten the rolling farmland and winding rivers. Each night, her dreams straddled the line between the wolf she had been taught to be by her father and the nameless assassin she had trained to become across the sea. She wondered which version of herself would walk into the Red Keep on the day of her wedding. The capital came into view under a hazy sky, the outlines of the city's walls and towers shimmering in the afternoon sun. King's Landing was much as Arya remembered. Overcrowded, raucous, with the stench of too many people living too close. She felt a pang of old memories. She was a child again, hungry and ragged in Flea Bottom, chasing rumors and heartbreak in the gutters. Now she entered as a royal bride-to-be, escorted through the main gates by gold-cloaked guards who parted the throngs of city dwellers. Whispers spread like wildfire. The North had come, bringing a Stark daughter to wed the king. Many still remembered the tragedies of her family here. They recalled Ned Stark's public execution, the horrors that followed for the Starks in the capital. The city's shape had changed over the years. War, fire, and the dethronement of Cersei Lannister had wrought their transformations. but Arya could still taste the old ghosts in the thick, grimy air. She reminded herself that she was not that helpless girl anymore, that she had survived the darkest nights across the sea. She was an instrument of her own destiny now. They led her group to the Red Keep, that sprawling fortress perched high above Blackwater Bay, its red stones turning gold under the late sun. She glanced up at the walls and turrets, recalling the vantage points from which she had once surveyed the city as a silent observer, back when she was lost, alone, and hunted. If the fortress seemed imposing then, it felt doubly so now with the knowledge that it was to become her new home. Within the courtyard, scores of courtiers waited, lords and ladies in brightly colored silks, knights in shining plate, the braziers lit and flickering as the day's light waned. All eyes fell upon her as she dismounted. A steward stepped forward and ushered her inside, where she glimpsed a towering figure in black and red standing at the far end of the great hall. King Aegon Targaryen in the flesh. He was slender of build, with silver gold hair that fell to his shoulders, and he held himself with poised confidence. Not as brash as Daenerys, not as overtly intense as the stories told of Rhaegar, if rumors could be believed. Yet there was something carefully measured in his every motion, the kind of command that came from years of forging alliances and steering his own destiny. His eyes were a deep violet, that signature Targaryen trait, and they regarded Arya with a combination of curiosity and caution. In that first moment, as she stood in the hall's hush, she realized he was likely as unsure of her as she was of him. The wolf and the dragon. They would have to find a way to coexist, even if only for appearance's sake. Their wedding was announced for a fortnight hence. The crown's lords and ladies were to gather. The city would celebrate, and Arya Stark, who once could vanish into any crowd, was about to be the very center of attention for the entire realm. Amid the swirl of political niceties, she maintained her distance. She noticed the members of the king's court who observed her openly or in furtive glances. Lord Giles Rosby, perpetually coughing into a perfumed sleeve. Lady Connington, a stern woman rumored to be some distant kin or loyal retainer to the Targaryens. Over them all, the king's hand, Sir John Connington, loomed with a protective aura. Old wounds from the rebellion days, perhaps, lingering loyalties that had propelled Aegon's cause to reclaim the throne. They were eager to see if the North would be truly loyal, if Arya Stark was a threat or a docile bride. So she curtsied where she had to, answering politely with minimal words. She let them think her shy or reticent. In truth, she was measuring them. The shift of their weight on their heels, the small smirks or frowns that signaled where their hearts lay. Every bit of information was a weapon, and she intended to collect them all. Her wedding gown arrived a day later. It was made of silver lace layered over gray silk, the direwolf of House Stark embroidered discreetly into the bodice, while a subtle motif of dragons wove around the train. She touched the fabric, feeling an odd mix of revulsion and fascination. Part of her still wanted to wear leathers and carry needle at her side. But Sansa had taught her that appearances in court were as important as steel on the battlefield. So she let the maids dress her, style her hair so that it fell in soft northern braids that cascaded down her back, accenting the long shape of her neck. The morning of the wedding, she slipped a small blade into a hidden sheath beneath her sleeve, a silent concession to the girl she once was. No matter how many layers of silk they put on her, she would never be unarmed. The wedding itself took place in the newly refurbished throne room. Light streamed in from high windows, reflecting off the Targaryen sigil that flanked the walls. The hush was profound as she walked down an aisle of polished marble. Torchlight and sunlight blended in a curious dance across the crowd's faces. The king stood at the end, wearing black with hints of crimson trim. His hair was freshly washed, gleaming like pale gold. As she approached, she stole a quick glance at his eyes. They betrayed little, just a flicker of something that might have been respect or a well-guarded calculation. She wondered if he truly cared about this match beyond the political advantage. Then again, she told herself sternly, it didn't matter if he cared. She wasn't here to be adored. She was here for the North, and for her own brand of justice if it ever came to that. The Septons spoke the vows, and Arya repeated them in a steady voice, her heart thrumming in her ears. She was aware of the hundreds of gazes upon her. Some looked at her with envy, some with contempt or curiosity. All had come to see this bridging of old enmities, Targaryen and Stark, a union that had never been and might never be again. When Aegon placed the ring on her finger, a band of Valyrian steel with a single pale gemstone, it felt strangely cold against her skin. The final pronouncement echoed in the hall. King Aegon Targaryen and Queen Arya of House Stark. Applause filled the space, a sudden roar. Arya lifted her gaze and allowed herself one quick breath. Her eyes scanned the crowd until she found a pair of northern guards she trusted. They met her look with grim nods, as if to remind her she wasn't alone, no matter what walls might close in around her. The king leaned to kiss her cheek. She felt the slightest brush of his lips, perfunctory, courtly. They turned to face the assembled lords and ladies, and so it was done. That night, the feasting was relentless. Tables overflowed with roasted boar, spiced wine, honeyed fruits, and lavish confections shaped like dragons. Minstrels played in every corner, their tunes competing for attention. Dancers whirled through the hall, their bright garments spinning in a blur. Lords and ladies lined up to offer their blessings to the new royal couple, each hoping to secure favor. Arya, resplendent in her queenly attire, sat stiffly at the high table. A goblet of wine in front of her went mostly untouched. She'd learned to be wary of what she drank in the capital. Aegon was by her side, occasionally leaning in to whisper a courteous remark about some visiting dignitary or to comment on the lavish display. The stilted politeness between them felt like a performance meant for the crowd. Her stoic half-smiles, his princely nods. But beneath it all, a tension simmered. She could sense he was analyzing her every reaction, trying to gauge how this northern wolf would adapt or resist. Late into the night, she slipped away from the feast. Courtiers might gossip, but let them. She navigated the corridors of the Red Keep by memory until she reached the Godswood. There had been rumors that the weirwood tree was gone, burned or chopped down in some prior upheaval. But to her surprise, she found it still standing in the courtyard garden, albeit smaller than the one in Winterfell, overshadowed by tall walls. A slender trunk with the carved face of a weirwood, eyes stained red as though weeping. The hush there was a different kind than the hush of a crowded hall. It was gentle, private. She stood under the heart tree's pale branches, letting the quietness soak into her bones. She touched the trunk, feeling the old magic. Would her father's spirit watch over her here? She let her eyes drift shut, remembering the wolf in her blood. If the southern Godswood was any less potent, she still felt something stir. A vow in her heart that she would protect her home, no matter the cost. The night air was cool, carrying a hint of the sea, a briny breeze that ruffled her hair. Footsteps on gravel made her turn. King Aegon approached, forgoing the typical retinue of guards. He paused at the edge of the clearing, as if uncertain whether to intrude. In the moonlight, the silver in his hair looked almost ghostly, and the planes of his face seemed sharper. "Your Grace," she greeted quietly, the words still strange on her tongue. She wondered if it felt equally strange for him to call her queen. He approached, a polite distance maintained. For a moment, neither spoke. Then he remarked that he'd never truly understood the worship of the old gods. She answered that it was less about understanding and more about feeling. He let the silence sit between them again before admitting that he was not certain how to begin their marriage. She gave a curt nod, acknowledging the truth. They were strangers bound by alliance, each with loyalties that could conflict. She sensed he wanted an assurance of loyalty, or at least an indication of what lay beneath her stoic exterior. But Arya offered no easy comfort. She simply looked him in the eye and said they would do their duties by each other. He accepted her words with a fractional incline of his head. Then he turned and left her to the quiet of the Godswood, as though he understood that tonight, of all nights, she needed solitude more than conversation. The next weeks were a blur of court functions and political tasks that came with being queen. Arya discovered quickly that the role demanded a delicate dance of cordiality. She was expected to sit in on sessions of the small council, to meet with ambassadors, to play hostess at dinners. She learned how to hide her keen observations behind a composed facade. No one, it seemed, expected her to be overly articulate in matters of state. Assuming she was too northern, too unrefined in the ways of southern intrigue. Let them underestimate me, she thought. She listened more than she spoke, gleaning tidbits of information, mapping the alliances and rivalries. She noticed how certain lords flinched at the mention of new taxes, how others crowed about their loyalty. Whenever she felt overwhelmed, she slipped away to the old tunnels she had once run through as a lost girl. Many of them were still accessible, though some had caved in. She explored them at night by torchlight, her heart steady, her steps silent. She marked the routes that led near council chambers, found the hidden alcoves behind walls where she could overhear conversations. Each new discovery became a strand of her invisible web. Not that everything went smoothly. She had run-ins with courtiers who tested her. One in particular, Lady Tiora Haraway, a minor noble from the Crownlands, seemed determined to provoke her, dropping barbed comments about the North, the savage ways of the Starks, the rumored madness that might lie in a house who'd endured so much. Arya endured those slights, offering only the frostiest of smiles, noting which words drew gasps or laughter from the onlookers. She filed it all away. To her surprise, a few nights later, King Aegon approached her privately to apologize for Lady Haraway's behavior. He expressed a mild disappointment in his courtiers for their lack of courtesy. She studied him in the golden lamplight of her new solar, searching for any sign of calculation. Was this genuine? She found no immediate clue, only the careful manners of a man who might be attempting to foster goodwill. She offered him a measured nod of thanks, but let the moment pass without warmth. The king had yet to earn her trust. Their bedchamber was opulent, red velvet drapes, polished floors, intricately carved furniture. At night, she and Aegon shared the space, but often he'd be absorbed in council matters until late, or she would linger in the library or the godswood until she was certain of a solitary rest. Intimacy was sparse in the early days. The realm expected an heir, but the king seemed hesitant, perhaps not wishing to force that closeness too soon. Arya, for her part, found the idea of bearing a Targaryen heir both alarming and inevitable. Perhaps in time, she thought, if the North truly benefited, if the realm truly found peace. But for now, an unspoken distance stretched between them, and they rarely breached that barrier. Despite everything, Arya was not idle in her mission. She made secret contact with Sansa, sending coded letters. "The dragon has wings but does not always breathe fire," she wrote in one. "The wolf sniffs the air for storms." The messages were subtle enough that if intercepted, they might sound like a child's fable or idle musings. But Sansa, clever as she was, would understand the subtext. Arya's main mission was to figure out how stable this Targaryen rule truly was. Could the North trust the new king, or was another war inevitable? From her vantage point at the small council sessions, she discerned that the realm's coffers were strained from prior conflicts. Rebellious lords in the Reach and Stormlands still held grudges for old slights. The Iron Islands were restless again, seeking advantage. Aegon, aided by his advisors, was treading a careful line between appeasement and enforcement, trying to reunify after the chaos left by Cersei Lannister's fall. Arya took note of which regions remained resentful, which factions might be swayed. Should the day come when the North must break from the crown, she wanted to know who might stand with them or be vulnerable to sabotage. Time flowed in a strange current at King's Landing. The days were filled with public duties, the nights with hushed reconnaissance. Arya became adept at reading faces in the council chamber, at spotting the quiver of a hand that signaled a lie or an evasion. She trained in secret with a few trusted guards, maintaining her swordsmanship and honing her reflexes. She was queen, yes, but she refused to let herself go soft. In the hush of her personal armory, she practiced with needle, each thrust and parry a reminder of who she was. The Targaryen wedding ring glittered on her finger as she gripped the sword's hilt, and it felt sometimes like a manacle. Still, she pressed on. Step by step, She was building a vantage from within the lion's den, though it was no longer a lion's but a dragon's. Aegon began inviting her to walk the gardens with him, to see new construction projects in the city. He took her to the harbor to watch the royal fleet and explained his desire to rebuild the navy, as Daenerys once had dreamed, to keep the shipping lanes safe. At times, he asked for her perspective or what the North might think. She answered carefully, not wanting to reveal the full strength of her mind just yet. But gradually, something like a rapport formed. A fragile thing, glimpses of earnestness in him that stirred a reluctant flicker of respect in her. He seemed determined not to become a tyrant like the Mad King, nor a complacent ruler who neglected his people. Now and then, she found herself half admiring the careful steps he took to strengthen alliances. Yet she reminded herself that many well-intentioned kings had become nightmares. She remained watchful. One evening, after a particularly tense council session about how to deal with a rebellious lord in the stormlands, Aegon asked Arya directly if she believed he should crush the rebellion swiftly or attempt peaceful negotiations. She was startled by how openly he sought her counsel. The other counselors had their own biases. Some thirsted for war, others wanted to placate the Lord. Arya considered it, remembering her father's lessons on justice, recalling her experiences that taught her cruelty begets only more cruelty. She answered that a swift strike might quell rebellion in the short term, but in the long term, fear can never truly hold a kingdom together. She suggested sending envoys first, ensuring that if violence did come, the realm would see the rebels as the aggressors. Aegon nodded, absorbing her words. That night, she overheard him telling his hand that the Wolf Queen had a mind for cunning. It was the closest thing to praise she'd ever heard from him. Yet, for all her careful assimilation, danger lurked. She sensed it in the corridors, in the sly glances between certain lords. Rumors swirled that the new king's claim to the throne was not as ironclad as he insisted. Some whispered that the real Aegon Targaryen had perished in the sack of King's Landing decades ago, and this man was an impostor nurtured by Varys and the Golden Company. Others said he was legitimate but overshadowed by his Aunt Daenerys' memory, that the realm might have preferred her had she not died in the cataclysmic battle for the capital. Arya paid attention to these murmurs. Truth or not, any rumor could weaken a king's hold, and she needed to know the shape of that vulnerability. Meanwhile, she encountered watchers in the shadows, figures who might have been following her. Once, she caught a man creeping outside her solar at midnight. She confronted him, but he slunk away before she could pin him down. She reported it to the King's Guard, who promised to investigate, but she had little faith they would. One night, not long after the near encounter with her stalker, she managed to slip into a restricted section of the Red Keep. Using the hidden passages she remembered, she crept toward the old dungeons where traitors had once been kept. The air was damp, a faint drip of water echoing through the stale corridors. She held a torch in one hand, needle in the other. She couldn't say exactly what she hoped to find. Maybe proof of the king's hidden dealings, or a stockpile of secrets the crown wanted buried. But as she ventured deeper, a figure emerged from the gloom, sword drawn. Arya dropped her torch to free her sword hand, and the flickering light danced grotesque shadows against the walls. Steel clashed on steel. She was outmatched in size, but she flowed with the grace she'd learned in Bravos, weaving away from the brute strength of her assailant. At one point, she slid under his guard and pressed needle's point to his throat. The light illuminated his face just enough for her to see the insignia on his cloak. A coiled dragon, one of Aegon's men evidently. He hissed that she had no business here, that these chambers were off-limits, and demanded she return to her quarters. She might have killed him then, but she recalled the vow she made to herself, to remain the watchful wolf, not the wanton assassin. She stepped away. He lowered his sword just enough for her to slip past. She fled back to her room, heart pounding. Whoever was controlling access to those dungeons clearly did not want prying eyes. But whether Aegon was behind it or someone else in the Red Keep, she couldn't be sure. In the following days, tension flared between her and the king. He questioned her about the confrontation, having clearly been informed by his men. She stood rigid, refusing to apologize, stating only that she had a right to explore her new home. He pressed her for a reason, and she offered a vague explanation that she wanted to see if the Red Keep was as labyrinthine as she remembered. He did not seem pleased, but he also did not lose his temper. There was a quiet anger in him, though. She realized that this marriage was not a one-sided arrangement. He had his own expectations, his own wariness about her. She felt a chill when he said, "Queen or not, you walk a dangerous path by venturing into shadows that do not belong to you." She met his stare, unyielding. "I've walked in more dangerous shadows before," she replied. They stared at one another in a standoff of wills, neither flinching. Then he turned and strode away, his cloak billowing behind him, leaving her uncertain whether she had gained a measure of respect or fanned the flames of suspicion. Days slipped into weeks, and their interactions fell into a tense rhythm. At council, they showed a united front, discussing trade issues with bravos, border disputes, the rebellious lords. In private, they exchanged curt words, both guarded. Yet she noticed fleeting moments when he almost seemed to relax in her presence, like after a session where they aligned in council to quell a corruption scheme. He had turned to her afterward and murmured, "Well done, my queen," so quietly that only she heard. It was the closest thing to genuine camaraderie they'd shared. There were other nights, however, when she awoke alone in the bedchamber, only to find him pacing near the balcony overlooking Blackwater Bay, as if he wrestled with ghosts. She never intruded, never asked if he was all right. She recognized that look. It was the look of someone burdened with knowledge they could not share. She had worn that look herself countless times. The city took to calling her the Wolf Queen, sometimes with affection, sometimes with derision. She heard the murmurs as she moved through the courtyards, as if she were some wild creature the king had tamed. Let them believe that. She was not tamed, only biding her time. The more she observed, the more she sensed a network of shadowy influences within the keep. Some might be leftover Lannister loyalists, others might be opportunists waiting to see if this Targaryen would falter. She discovered a carefully orchestrated ring of information brokers, funneling secrets to an unknown power. She could not determine if they served the king or if they were working against him. More than once, she glimpsed ravens departing at odd hours with no official dispatch. She overheard scraps of conversation indicating bribes and hush money. She gathered it all, writing coded updates to Sansa, ensuring that the North spymaster, yes, Sansa had learned to cultivate her own intelligence network, would be informed of every subtlety. Amid the swirl of intrigue, personal matters intruded. The realm had begun to speculate when the new queen would conceive an heir. Courtiers politely inquired, or not so politely. Arya brushed them off with frigid politeness. Aegon seemed uncomfortable whenever the subject arose in official capacity, but in private, he brought it up once, suggesting that they could not postpone it indefinitely. Her jaw clenched. She said that if the realm demanded a child, it would happen in due course, but she would not be rushed or forced. For a moment, his eyes flashed with an emotion she could not name. Hurt, perhaps, or resignation. He gave a stiff bow and left. She was left with the uneasy sense that this was bigger than either of them, that it was the realm's hunger for continuity that pressed in on them like a vice. One afternoon, she came upon the king in the library. He was hunched over a tome of dragon lore, candlelight casting flickering shadows on the table. She paused by the doorway. He did not see her at first. She almost slipped away, but curiosity anchored her in place. She watched the crease in his brow, the way his eyes scanned the ancient text. He muttered something under his breath, something about prophecy and lineage. She caught words like prince that was promised. A memory of Melisandre's fiery prophecies surfaced in Arya's mind. That Red Priestess had once believed Stannis Baratheon was chosen by Lawler, then shifted her faith to Jon Snow. So many claims, so many illusions. At length, Aegon noticed her. He shut the book abruptly. For an instant, she saw a flicker of vulnerability in his gaze. "I'm no messiah," he said quietly, without preamble, as if reading her thoughts. "I just want to be a king who can keep this realm from devouring itself." She studied him for a moment, uncertain how to respond. Then she offered a tentative truth of her own. "I've spent so long avenging the past. I barely know how to live for the future." Their eyes met, neither sure what to do with that shared honesty. Then, just as quickly, the moment passed. The next morning brought a jolt of chaos to the court. A secret missive arrived, reporting that a small holdfast loyal to the crown had been burned in the Reach. Evidence suggested it was done by a splinter group of rebels who opposed Aegon's claim. Tensions soared. The king called an urgent session with his council to decide how to respond. Arya was there, observing the swirl of panic, the calls for retribution. Some counselors insisted on sending a royal force to crush these rebels. Others warned that such aggression would only stir more resentment. Aegon presided over the debate with a grave face. Finally, he turned to Arya, seeking her counsel. She suggested a careful approach. Send scouts first, gather undeniable proof of who orchestrated the attack, then confront them swiftly, but with minimal collateral damage. She reminded the council of how the North had learned to handle wildling raids, by showing strength without cruelty, striking at the leaders, not the small folk. Her words carried weight, surprising even her. The king nodded, issuing orders accordingly. After the council adjourned, he quietly thanked her for her clarity. She gave a brief nod, then left the chamber, unsettled by how naturally she had slipped into this role. Days later, a small group of the king's men rode out to address the threat in the Reach. Arya, sensing an opportunity to glean more about the realm's undercurrents, insisted on accompanying them, but the king refused, citing the dangers. She argued, reminding him she was no delicate lady to be sequestered. He hesitated, torn between caution and a reluctant respect for her prowess. In the end, he relented under the condition that a proper escort accompany her. And so she rode south again, this time as queen, with a retinue that included the king's personal guard and several northern soldiers loyal to her. The ride was swift and purposeful, the sun beating down on them as they approached the region where the holdfast had been raised. Smoke still lingered in the air, the blackened remains of homes and granaries a grim testament to the cruelty that had taken place. Small folk eyed them warily from a distance, some dropping to their knees in fear. Arya's heart clenched. It reminded her too much of the devastation she had seen in the Riverlands during the War of the Five Kings. As they investigated, it became clear that a band of mercenaries had carried out the attack, mercenaries rumored to be hired by a rogue Bannister of House Tyrell's lesser lines. Desperate men seeking to undermine the Targaryen claim. Some scrawled graffiti called the king a mummer's dragon. Arya's escort found a lead, a minor retainer who had overheard the mercenaries speaking of further raids. Through patient interrogation, they uncovered the location of a small camp nestled in a wooded area, where rebels were planning their next strike. Without waiting for word from the king, time was short. Arya decided to lead a swift strike on the camp to prevent further atrocities. Her guards exchanged uneasy looks, but she was their queen. They pressed on under cover of dusk. The battle was brief but fierce. Arya remembered every lesson from her youth in Winterfell and her training in Bravos. She moved like a shadow among the trees, dispatching two men with quick thrusts before they even knew she was there. The rest of her escort charged in, clashing steel against steel. A horse screamed. A man fell. The ring of swords was deafening in the night air. One mercenary lunged at Arya, and she parried with needle, pivoting smoothly to slash across his exposed thigh. He stumbled with a cry, and she finished him with a clean thrust. Fear no longer gripped her in moments like this. She had long since learned to harness it, to let it sharpen her instincts. When the last of the rebels lay dead or captured, she surveyed the carnage under the flicker of torches. Some of the men stared at her in awe, as if they had not believed the stories of her skill until now. Yet she took no pride in the killing. It felt like an echo of her old life, the one she had never fully escaped. They returned to King's Landing victorious, with prisoners who confessed to being hired to spread terror in Aegon's name. By the time they re-entered the Red Keep, news of her actions had spread like wildfire. She found Aegon in the council chamber, conferring with his advisors. When she stepped inside, battered but resolute, he rose from his seat, his expression taut. Wordlessly, he gestured for her to join him in private. Once alone, he let out a breath that was somewhere between relief and exasperation. "I've heard what you did," he said. "You could have been killed." She stared back, refusing to be scolded like a child. "I did what needed to be done," she said. "If I'm to be queen, it won't be just in name. The North expects me to protect our interests, and in so doing, I have served the crowns as well." He let the silence reign a moment, then sighed. "You're reckless," he said softly, "but effective. The realm owes you a debt." She watched as he lifted a hand, almost as if to touch her cheek, but halted midway. Then he lowered it, adopting a solemn composure once more. The tension between them crackled with unfamiliar closeness, as though the walls they had built were faltering for a moment. But neither stepped past that barrier. Over the following months, Arya's reputation among the common folk improved. Stories spread of the Wolf Queen who fought with sword in hand, who walked the city streets in plain clothes to see the people's plight. Of course, the stories were embellished, but some kernel of truth shone through. Even some of the southern lords began to treat her with grudging respect. A queen who could swing a blade as deftly as any knight was unusual, if not wholly shocking. Meanwhile, she continued her quiet espionage, mapping out the hidden influences at court. More than once, she snuffed out conspiracies to undermine Aegon. Each time she chose carefully whether to bring her findings to him directly or handle it with a subtler approach. In the process, she found herself confiding more in him. Strange as it was, the king had become her reluctant ally in preserving the realm's fragile stability. She told herself it was purely strategic. And yet, there were moments when his wry half-smile or the quiet sincerity in his gaze stirred something in her chest. She fought it down, reminding herself of her mission. Love or affection had no place in her life. She was a Stark. She was a survivor. Eventually, though, survival in King's Landing demanded forging unexpected bonds. A cold winter crept closer, and the harvests in certain regions faltered. Grain stores ran low, even as the city's population ballooned with refugees fleeing unrest elsewhere. A crisis loomed. While the Crown's Council argued over how to manage dwindling resources, Arya suggested a plan to ration supplies and open up new trade routes with the North, which had stockpiles from a prudent harvest. But that required delicate negotiation. She took it upon herself to speak with her sister. In coded letters that bristled with urgency, she and Sansa arranged to have caravans of grain sent south, regulated so that the capital's poorest would receive some measure of sustenance. The crown footed part of the bill, but the rest was a gesture of good faith from the North, a step toward bridging old divides. When the first shipment arrived, greeted by lines of hungry smallfolk, Arya and Aegon stood together to oversee its distribution. She could see the relief and gratitude in the people's eyes, and for a moment, she felt something akin to hope. Perhaps this alliance could serve more than just mutual suspicion and convenience. Still, her life at court was a razor's edge. She discovered the traitors behind the restricted dungeons. They were not the king's men, but a clandestine group that had infiltrated the Red Keep long ago, serving a wealthy patron who despised Targaryen restoration. She confronted them one moonless night, cornering their ringleader in the crypt-like passages beneath the castle. With a dagger at his throat, she forced out names of co-conspirators: a minor lord in the Westerlands, a merchant prince from Essos, a handful of disillusioned men within the capital. She spared the man's life long enough to deliver him to the king, insisting that Aegon see the rot within his own court. Together, they uprooted the network, leading to arrests and trials. It was the first time she saw him look at her with something like genuine gratitude, maybe even awe, as the conspirators were sent to the dungeons. He turned to her in the quiet corridor, the lamplight flickering over the sharp planes of his face, and said, "I never thought the day would come when I'd call a Stark my fiercest ally." She allowed herself a small smile, just a ghost of one. "We're not allies," she corrected gently. "We're doing what needs to be done." Despite her protest, that was the moment a shift began. Little by little, the distance between them thinned. When they shared supper, he asked about her family, and she found herself recalling gentle memories of Ned Stark, how he would watch her practice archery in the courtyard, never scolding her for being unladylike. Aegon listened, offering small recollections of his own. Stories of John Connington's guardianship, how the Golden Company shaped his youth. On some evenings, they would walk in the Godswood, talking in hushed voices about the realm's troubles, the uncertain future. She found herself revealing glimpses of her time across the narrow sea, though she held back the darkest secrets of her faceless man training. And Aegon confessed that he feared repeating the tragedies of Targaryen history, that the weight of the crown sometimes felt like a chain dragging him into a sea of expectations. In time, their marriage bed was no longer just a political arrangement. It was still cautious, tinged with the baggage they both carried, but it wasn't entirely empty. Arya learned the curve of his shoulder, the steady rhythm of his breathing when he slept. He learned how to trace the faint scars on her arms without asking too many questions. Neither declared love. Both were too guarded for that. But an unspoken bond took root, woven from mutual respect, from the shared burdens of ruling in turbulent times. Sansa wrote to her, expressing cautious optimism about the alliance. She hinted that tensions in the north had subsided, that the old lords who once whispered about possible rebellion were acknowledging the benefits of a Targaryen queen with Stark blood. Arya knew that some northerners would never fully trust the south, but it was a step toward stability. And for the first time, Arya wondered if she had found a semblance of a life she could belong to. Yet the wolf in her soul, the girl who'd survived by wearing masks and reciting the names of her enemies, refused to be lulled into complacency. She remained vigilant. Soon, the days began to darken earlier as winter crept over the realm. The King's Council turned its attention to reinforcing the major roads against snow, ensuring the harvest was properly stored. And Arya Discov aired a new urgency stirring in Aegon. He spoke often of forging alliances across the sea, ensuring the powerful free cities wouldn't meddle in Westerosi affairs. The Iron Bank needed to be kept in good standing. The nights he spent poring over maps grew longer. He took to meeting envoys from distant corners of Essos, and on several occasions he asked Arya to join. She soon realized that he was grooming her to handle matters of state if ever he was away, or if war forced him out of the capital. The weight of that responsibility made her chest tighten, yet part of her welcomed it. She had never been a lady content to watch from the sidelines. All the while, she continued to intercept small conspiracies. She foiled a smuggling ring that was defrauding the crown. She exposed a plot by a group of exiled lords who sought to bring down the Targaryen regime by poison. Each time, she acted decisively, without hesitation. Rumors spread that the Wolf Queen had eyes everywhere. Some believed she was a witch, others claimed she commanded the ghosts of the dead. Arya let them have their stories. They served as a deterrent. Eventually, even the king's closest advisors seemed to accept that while she might be unorthodox, she was undeniably effective at maintaining order. In the swirl of these events, she realized with a start that she was no longer simply spying on the crown from within. She was shaping the crown, becoming integral to its strength. The thought gave her pause. Who was she serving now? Was she betraying the North by committing so thoroughly to her role as queen? Or was she safeguarding it, ensuring that if the Targaryen rule persisted, it would be one that respected the Starks, respected the realm's diversity? Maybe both truths could coexist. On many nights, she lingered by the Godswood, hoping the old gods would give her a sign. But all she heard was the wind rustling the leaves. Her internal conflicts came to a head one blisteringly cold morning when Sansa arrived in the capital unannounced. Accompanied by a small retinue of northern knights, the Lady of Winterfell swept into the Red Keep, her expression unreadable. Arya hurried to meet her sister in one of the private antechambers. The two women embraced, though Sansa's posture was tense. Over the course of a subdued conversation, Sansa revealed that tensions had flared in the north again. Some lords questioned whether Arya's alliance was overshadowing northern autonomy. She had come to see the situation firsthand, to speak to the king, to gauge whether the north should continue in this union. Arya felt a pang of guilt. She had grown so accustomed to her dual role that she hadn't anticipated how it might appear from the outside. She told Sansa everything, minus the darkest corners of her subterfuge. She spoke of the conspiracies she'd quashed, the precarious stability Aegon was trying to maintain, the grudging respect that had blossomed between them. Sansa listened quietly. At length, she placed a hand on Arya's cheek, studying her like a mother would. "You're different," she said softly. "We all changed, but you... This is not the same girl who left Winterfell." Arya looked away, not sure how to respond. Then Sansa straightened her shoulders. "I trust you," she said, "but I needed to look you in the eye and see for myself. We cannot sacrifice the North for a dream of peace that might be a lie." Arya nodded, understanding. It was all she could offer. That afternoon, Sansa met with Aegon. Arya stood by, listening as her sister calmly questioned the king about taxes, about the deployment of troops in the north, about the measures to protect northern interests. Aegon responded with measured courtesy, outlining his policies, affirming that the north retained its own governance under Lady Sansa's leadership. He even proposed that the North's lords be allowed to form a special council in King's Landing to voice regional concerns. Sansa seemed pleasantly surprised by his openness. Afterward, she confided in Arya that the king might not be the monster some in the north believed. Arya felt a flicker of relief. Whatever else might come, Sansa's approval meant everything. She was the Lady of Winterfell. If she believed in this alliance, it would hold. That evening they dined together, the king, Arya, and Sansa. For the first time in years, Arya felt a faint echo of warmth like a family meal, albeit a far cry from those simpler days with her parents and siblings. When the time came for Sansa to return north, she departed with calmer assurances that the north would remain allied with the crown, at least for now. As Arya watched her sister's retinue ride away, she felt a pang of longing for home. But home had become this place, these stone corridors and secret passages, these cunning negotiations, these improbable alliances. A wolf queen in a dragon's den. In the days that followed, she wrote a coded letter to Sansa, summarizing new developments at court, her attempt to remain transparent. She kept it subtle, never forgetting that ravens could be intercepted. But it brought her some peace to maintain that line of communication. Winter's edge grew sharper. Frost coated the Red Keep's windows on certain mornings. The king's staff lit braziers in the corridors to combat the chill. Fleets from across the narrow sea came bearing goods for trade, and the city bustled in a frantic attempt to stockpile essentials. Through it all, Aegon and Arya found themselves increasingly aligned, forging a precarious trust. He asked her counsel more often. She shared her findings more freely. They still fought at times. Arya's brash methods clashed with his more diplomatic approach. But their arguments no longer ended in cold silence. They became a crucible in which solutions were forged. Late one night, as she prepared for bed, Arya stood by the window, gazing at the faint outline of the city below. She could see a few ships bobbing in the bay, lanterns glowing on their decks. Behind her, Aegon entered quietly, removing his heavy cloak. He paused beside her, following her gaze. She sensed his presence, the warmth of him in the chilled air. It reminded her how different her life had become. She had lived in so many identities, worn so many faces. Yet here she stood, unmasked as Arya Stark, now Arya Targaryen in name. The quiet stretched. Finally, he spoke softly. "I never asked for your heart, only your partnership. But I find myself wondering if you can ever truly trust me." His words echoed in the stillness. She turned to look at him. In the flickering candlelight, he appeared neither wholly certain nor wholly doubtful. She weighed her reply. "Trust is earned," she said, "and you've earned more of it than I ever expected to give." It wasn't a love confession, but it was an admission of a kind. He regarded her for a long moment. Then he nodded, accepting her guarded truth, just as she accepted his. Together, they turned back to watch the silent city, the hush of the night broken only by the distant crash of waves against the harbor. Two rulers bound by a fragile but deepening connection, each wearing scars that might never fully heal. And so Arya Stark remained, the Wolf Queen in King's Landing, neither captive nor guest, but something in between. She had come to spy on the crown from within, to ensure the safety of her home. In doing so, she had shaped the realm's destiny alongside the king she had once viewed only as a potential enemy. Their story was woven into the tapestry of a Westeros, still healing from the ravages of war, still learning what it meant to follow a new monarch. Arya did not know if this tenuous peace would endure forever. She only knew that for now, her claws were sunk into the fabric of power, her instincts sharp, her loyalty to the North unwavering. If the day came when the dragon turned on the wolf, she would bare her teeth without hesitation. But in the meantime, she would stand by his side, forging alliances, thwarting conspiracies, and quietly redefining what it meant to be a queen in a land where her family had once been betrayed and broken. Winter had not yet fully settled over the capital, but the winds foretold its approach. Soldiers donned thicker cloaks. The small folk gathered fuel for their hearths. Ravens came and went with urgent messages about snow in distant parts of the kingdom. In the Red Keep's courtyard, the king and queen inspected the royal guard, addressing their concerns about the weather, about potential raids from outlaws driven desperate by hunger. A hush fell as the guards snapped to attention. Arya's keen eyes swept over them, missing nothing. She offered a curt nod, mindful that the respect she commanded now was as much due to fear of her reputation as it was to her royal status. She had no illusions about how quickly fear could sour into hatred, how easily prestige could slip through one's fingers. She had no illusions about the precariousness of the crown itself. After the inspection, as they walked back inside, Aegon leaned in and said, quietly, "Do you ever imagine what it would be like if we didn't have to wear these titles? If I were not a king and you not a queen?" She gave him a sidelong glance, considering the weight of that idea. "Sometimes," she answered, "but I was never meant for a simple life. Neither were you." He let out a soft huff of agreement, and with that, they continued to navigate the labyrinth of politics and alliances, forging a cautious path that straddled distrust and cooperation. Whether Arya was still only a spy or had become something more was a question that lingered, unspoken. She carried her father's memory like a lodestar, guiding her moral compass. If there was a future for her children, if she ever bore them, it would be one where they could walk both the North and the South without fear, bridging the scars of history. Every evening, beneath the shadow of the Iron Throne, she remembered the blood that had been spilled, the lives lost. She vowed to Sansa and to Bran, wherever he roamed in his mystical domain, that she would not let the North be dragged into another devastating war. If trust was the price of peace, she would pay it grudgingly, piece by piece, always keeping a blade ready behind her back. And in that guarded dance, she found a peculiar equilibrium with the king, a man who might also be forging himself anew, emerging from old stories and claims to define his own reign. In the gloom of the throne room one quiet morning, she stood alone before the Iron Throne itself, the melted swords twisted upward, a testament to conquest and ambition. She ran her fingers lightly over one of the metal protrusions, feeling the cold edge. She thought of the countless rulers who had sat upon it, each leaving their own legacy of triumphs and failures. She wondered what the bards would say of Arya Stark, the Wolf Queen who wed a Targaryen king, the girl who once had a list of names she recited before sleep. She remembered a time when she could not have imagined such a fate. And yet here she was, forging alliances, managing courtly affairs, and shaping the kingdom's future from within. Her father would not have wished this life for her, but maybe he would have understood that she was doing what she must, just as he once did when he rode south to be Hand of the King. Footsteps echoed behind her. She turned to see Aegon approaching, flanked by 2 Kingsguard knights. He dismissed them with a wave. They bowed and retreated, leaving the 2 of them alone in the cavernous throne room. He stepped closer, studying her face. "You look pensive," he observed. She let her hand drop from the throne. "Just thinking of the cost of power," she said. He glanced at the throne, then back at her. "Sometimes, I wish we could melt it down again," he murmured. "Forge something new out of the old, But perhaps that's just a dream. Her lips twisted into a faint smile. All great changes start as dreams, she replied, surprising herself with the optimism in her tone. He inclined his head in agreement, his violet eyes flickering with an unspoken resolve. Together, they left the throne room, stepping out into the corridors where attendants waited with urgent missives, and the day's tasks marched on relentlessly. And so Arya Stark, the Wolf Queen who once accepted a royal marriage to spy on the crown from within, walked side by side with the Targaryen king. Two souls shaped by battle and loss, forging a realm that might, if they were both cunning and fortunate, embrace peace. Yet always the undercurrent remained. If betrayal lurked within these walls, Arya would not hesitate to bare her fangs. For she was still a Stark of Winterfell, even as she wore the mantle of a queen. Her father's voice lingered in her mind. When the snows fall and the white winds blow, the lone wolf dies, but the pack survives. Perhaps this was her way of ensuring the pack survived, even if it meant living among dragons. In the hush of the Red Keep's corridors, she silently vowed, the North would never again be left at the mercy of Southern schemes. She would see to that, no matter how many faces she had to wear or how many hearts she had to outmaneuver. She was Arya Stark, after all, and the words of House Stark had always carried their own quiet power. Winter was coming, and for once, it would find a northern wolf perched in the heart of the dragon's lair, ready to guard her home with every breath. Arya awoke to the clang of distant bells echoing through the Red Keep's corridors, a low, resonant toll that heralded a new dawn in King's Landing. In the haze between sleep and waking, she lay for a moment on the grand bed, an opulent piece of carved ebony and silk draperies, and tried to recall where she was. It was a habit that lingered from her days as a wandering girl, when she had slept in stables, in alleyways, aboard ships, and in hidden corners. Now, her surroundings were not straw or stone, but velvet cushions and polished marble floors. Sunlight filtered in through tall windows, shining on the heavy Targaryen tapestries that adorned the chamber walls. She felt a fleeting pang, recalling the stark simplicity of Winterfell. Even after all these months, a part of her still bristled at the lavish southern trappings. She turned her head and saw Aegon dressing quietly by the wardrobe. He was already halfway into his black tunic, his hair still damp from a hastily taken bath. She remembered the shape of his shoulder under her fingertips in the late hours of the night, when talk of councils and conspiracies had quieted, and they were merely two souls trying to carve out a fragment of human connection in a world that demanded near-constant vigilance. She watched him now in the gentle morning light and wondered if he felt the same swirl of uncertainty she did each day. They had grown closer, cautiously so, but the trust between them was still a fragile bridge, each plank tested by the weight of suspicion that hung over the throne. He turned, glimpsed her lying there with sleep still in her eyes, and gave a slight nod. "We'll be needed in the council chamber soon," he said, his voice subdued. "The bells are for the arrival of the Dorne envoy. They were sighted at the city gates at first light." Arya pushed herself upright. She remembered from the prior evening's briefing. A delegation from Sunspear was due to discuss trade routes and the crown's new tax structure. Tensions with Dorne had run high ever since Prince Doran's line ended in tragedy, and though some years had passed, the bitterness had never fully dissolved. Arya had spent more time than she cared to admit studying genealogies and reading old accounts of Targaryen conquests in the south, gleaning any clue about the intricate pride of House Martell. This morning's meeting would be another test of her ability to navigate southern politics. A small part of her yearned to slip away into the labyrinth of tunnels beneath the keep, an easier realm of flickering torchlight and silence, but she rose from the bed instead, determined to meet the day's demands. She reached for the simple gown Sansa had once helped design for her, a subtle mixture of northern and southern influence. It bore the direwolf sigil discreetly on the bodice, complemented by a collar that echoed the Targaryen red in a subdued pattern. She still disdained courtly fashion, but this gown allowed her to move with ease, a compromise between stealth and formality. She recalled a time when she would have scoffed at the idea of wearing anything but leathers. Yet she had come to understand that wearing the right trappings could be as potent a weapon as a sword. As she dressed, She slipped a slim blade into the hidden sheath at her thigh. The feel of steel against her skin steadied her nerves. No matter how many courtiers gawked, she would never be unarmed. Aegon handed her a belt and she buckled it around her waist. They exchanged no further words as they left the bedchamber. Their personal guard, clad in the black and red cloaks of the Targaryen household, fell in behind them. Arya caught the cautious bow of one guardsman, a young knight who had admired her skill in the courtyard sparring sessions. He did not greet her with flamboyance, only a respectful lowering of his gaze. She appreciated that. She had little patience for sycophants, and even less for those who doubted her capability. They descended the stone steps leading to the council chamber, the walls echoing with each step of the guards' boots. As they neared the massive oak doors, the clamor of voices seeped through the cracks. Courtiers and officials already gathered inside. A steward whisked the door open, announcing them with a ceremonial flourish. The conversation died in an instant, all eyes turning on Arya and Aegon as they crossed the threshold. Arya recognized half a dozen familiar faces. Ser Jon Connington, the king's hand, stood near the head of the table, his silver hair thinning at the temples. Next to him was Lady Connington, his cousin and confidant. Lord Giles Rosby coughed delicately into his perfumed handkerchief, while Lady Tiora Haraway watched from the opposite side with her usual air of veiled disdain. Arya noted that the Dornish envoys had not yet arrived. She spied only the crown's officials. They were all waiting for the king and queen to begin. "We'll proceed shortly," Aegon said, gesturing for everyone to be seated. Servants poured wine and placed trays of bread and fruit on the sideboard. Arya took her chair at Aegon's left, a vantage from which she could watch most of the room. She sensed the unspoken tension that always crackled in these gatherings. Some respected her. Others viewed her as an interloper or a symbol of the North's infiltration. She schooled her expression into neutrality, determined to show no sign of discomfort. The Wolf Queen had to remain inscrutable. A hush descended as a pair of guards opened the far doors. The Dornish envoys stepped in, led by a tall woman wearing the loose robes of Sunspear's nobility. Her hair was done in dozens of small braids that fell around her shoulders. She was accompanied by two male attendants, both carrying slender swords at their belts. While the weapons made some of the council shift in unease, no one challenged the Dornish tradition of traveling armed. Aegon inclined his head, beckoning them to approach the table. "Welcome to King's Landing," he said in a formal tone. "We trust your journey was pleasant, Lady Nymella?" The woman, Lady Nymella Vaith, if Arya recalled correctly, stepped forward and bowed with a fluid grace. "The roads were as kind as one might hope in winter's approach," she replied. "We thank you for your hospitality, Your Grace." Arya scanned their faces, noticing that one of the male attendants seemed ill at ease, glancing around the chamber as though searching for hidden threats. She guessed they'd traveled through the stormlands, where rumors of bandit attacks had grown frequent. She made a mental note to see if Dorne's reticence in alliances had to do with security concerns. Even small details could illuminate deeper truths. The meeting commenced. Aegon welcomed the envoys to speak of their concerns. Lady Nymella explained that several caravans from Dorne had faced exorbitant tolls as they passed into the Crownlands, charges levied by local lords who claimed old rights predating the current regime. She demanded that those tolls be abolished or standardized to ease trade. Jon Connington argued that the tolls were necessary to maintain the roads, especially with winter looming. They sparred politely, each volley layered in diplomatic courtesy. Arya listened carefully, gleaning subtext. The Dornish were proud and had always guarded their autonomy. If the crown appeared too inflexible, they might reduce the flow of crucial southern produce that the capital desperately needed. She cleared her throat, drawing the attention of the table. "The roads do need upkeep, but we could adjust the toll structure so that only true upkeep costs are reflected," she said. "If local lords are pocketing coin for themselves, it must be curbed. Perhaps an impartial steward could be installed in each border holdfast, tasked with monitoring the toll usage. The crown can collect a modest portion, the local lord another, but it must be transparent. She watched the Dornish envoy's reactions. Lady Nemella nodded slowly, as if considering the idea. John Connington looked thoughtful, scribbling notes on a parchment. Aegon gazed at Arya for a heartbeat longer than usual, then gave a slight inclination of approval. The discussion resumed, more focused now, each side weighing possible compromises. Arya noted the tension in Lady Tiora Harroway's expression. No doubt the older woman disliked seeing Arya guide policy. Let her fume, Arya thought. It made no difference. The realm needed unity, especially between Dorne and the Crown, if they were to stave off future rebellions. When at last the meeting concluded, it was near midday. The Dornish envoys were escorted to guest chambers to rest before further negotiations. Aegon lingered in the council chamber, speaking with John Connington in hushed tones. Arya rose from her seat, ignoring the inquisitive stares of the lesser courtiers. She slipped out into the hallway, intending to find a quiet corner to collect her thoughts. A day of discussions with the envoys still lay ahead, and she preferred to approach negotiations with a calm mind. Yet no sooner had she rounded a corner than she nearly collided with Lady Tiora Harroway herself. The older woman wore an expression that wavered between a forced smile and condescension. "Your Grace," Lady Tiora said, curtsying with exaggerated politeness. "A fine performance in the council just now. I dare say you have a knack for speaking as though you were born to such matters." Arya narrowed her eyes fractionally. She recognized the veiled jibe, to imply Arya had no natural right to weigh in on crown policy, that she was merely a northern novelty. "Thank you," Arya replied coolly. "I appreciate your observation." Tiora pressed on, arching one thin brow. "I imagine Winterfell's stewardships run rather differently. But you adapt quickly, don't you? Perhaps that's what the king values most in you." Arya felt a flicker of annoyance, recalling the times she had endured Tiora's sly remarks. She reminded herself not to rise to the bait. Instead, she adopted a faint, polite smile. "The king values the North as well," she said. "And we Starks do what is needed for our people. I'm sure House Harroway shares the same devotion to its lineage." Tiora's smile tightened. "Indeed," she said. "If there is anything you need assistance with, do let me know. Navigating southern politics can be dreadfully confusing for those unaccustomed." She dipped another mocking curtsy and drifted away, her perfume lingering in the air like a cloying aftertaste. Arya exhaled slowly, brushing off the encounter. She was no stranger to subtle hostility, and Lady Tiora was but one of many who still doubted her place here. One day, perhaps, the woman would push too far, and Arya would not be so gracious. She took a steadying breath and continued toward the Godswood, welcoming the idea of quiet. The Red Keep's Godswood was smaller than Winterfell's, overshadowed by high walls and dwarfed by the sea of buildings that comprised King's Landing. Yet it possessed a distinct aura of tranquility. The slender weirwood stood at its center, its carved face watching in eternal silence. Arya approached it, letting the hush settle around her. When she rested her palm against the pale trunk, she closed her eyes, feeling the old magic thrumming beneath her skin. She whispered a silent greeting to the spirits of the north, wondering if they listened. Overhead, ravens circled. She could hear their distant caws echoing from the city's rooftops. A memory surfaced unbidden, of nights spent wandering cobblestone streets in Bravos, or the long trek across the countryside with Sandor Clegane, or those frantic chases through Flea Bottom as a child, half-starved and terrified. That girl was still in her somewhere, overshadowed now by the queenly role she'd adopted out of duty. The shape of her life had become so different that she sometimes hardly recognized herself. Yet the desire to protect her family, to outmaneuver foes, to ensure that the North never again suffered the fate it had under the Lannisters, that remained unchanged. Her thoughts were disrupted by the crunch of footsteps on gravel. She turned, expecting a guard or perhaps Aegon, but instead she found herself face to face with a man she had not seen in years. Her breath caught in her throat. Gendry stood before her, older now, tall and broad-shouldered in a plain leather jerkin. He wore no crown or sigil, only the faint sooty traces on his hands that she remembered from the smithy. For a moment, Neither spoke. It was as though time had bent back on itself, revealing the boy who had once shared scraps of food with her under a cart, the boy who had teased her about her fierce expressions, the last living bastard of King Robert Baratheon, though that claim was seldom spoken aloud. "Arya," he said softly, as though testing the name on his tongue. She swallowed hard. "Gendry," she managed. The sound of it felt strange in her mouth, stirring a swirl of old memories. The courtyard in Harrenhal, the roads they'd walked together, the nights by the fire. She realized how many lifetimes had passed since then. I didn't know you were here," he gave a lopsided shrug. "I arrived yesterday with a shipment of weapons for the crown's armory. Lord," he paused, as though the unfamiliar courtesy was a burr in his mouth. "King Aegon's master of arms put in a large order for new blades, armor repairs, that sort of thing." Arya nodded, trying to compose herself. 1,000 questions churned in her mind. She wanted to ask where he had been, how he had fared since they parted ways, whether he had truly claimed his Baratheon name or remained a free agent in the world of smithing. She wanted to ask if he had thought of her as she sometimes thought of him. Instead, she gestured to the quiet clearing. "Well, you found me in the only quiet place in this city." He smiled, a faint, familiar grin. "I've been around a bit. I know how to get into the keep if I want, but never thought I'd see you here. Queen Arya Targaryen, they say." His voice was gentle, without accusation or mockery, only an uneasy awe. "Is it strange?" he added softly, jerking his chin toward her attire, the clear markers of royalty. She felt an odd flush of embarrassment. I didn't plan it. Things happen." She let the unspoken swirl of her life story remain unsaid. He of all people would understand how fate could twist you into paths you never anticipated. They stood in silence for a beat longer, the hush of the gods wood enveloping them. She finally asked, "Will you be staying long?" His expression grew uncertain. "Not sure. I've a good position in the city's smithing guild now, forging steel for the crown. They pay well and there's plenty of work. I came to deliver the latest batch. Might head back to my forge near the Street of Steel in a day or two. But if more orders come, I'll be around." She nodded, words failing her. The swirl of emotion in her chest felt disorienting. Gendry had been one of the few remnants of her childhood that she cherished, an unexpected friend who had seen her without pretense. She wanted to say so much, but the weight of her current life pressed down. She was no longer just Arya. She was queen, and he was, "Your Grace." A voice startled them both. Arya turned to see a steward peeking into the godswood. The man bowed stiffly. "Forgive me, but the king has asked for you to join him in the solar. The Dornish envoys request your presence." She inhaled, trying to quell the sudden ache in her chest. "I'll be there shortly," she said, dismissing the steward. When she looked back at Gendry, he had taken a step back, as though bracing himself. Their gazes met, awkward yet threaded with unspoken history. She swallowed. "It was good to see you," she managed, wishing the words sounded less hollow. He gave a short nod. "And you?" After a moment, he added more softly, If you ever need a sword or armor, something forged by my hands, just send word." He hesitated, then bowed in an unrefined gesture that made her heart twist, and turned away to leave the godswood. She watched him disappear among the trees, the swirling autumn leaves catching in his dark hair. Only when he was gone did she release the breath she had been holding. She made her way out of the godswood, steeling herself. Already, her mind was jumping to the next duty, negotiations with the Dornish delegation. She tried to shove aside the memory of Gendry's face, the flicker of old warmth in his eyes. She reminded herself that her path was set. The North needed her here, the realm needed her here, and any illusions she might have once had about forging a different future belonged to a life she had shed like a snake's skin. Yet her heart hammered with the reminder that no matter how deeply she entangled herself in southern politics, she was still the girl who had run from Harrenhal with a sword in her hand and a name on her lips. Entering the solar, she found Aegon already seated at a small table with Lady Nemella and her attendants. The king offered Arya a brisk nod. He was deep in conversation about shipping lanes through the Sea of Dorne, but he paused to welcome her. She took a seat, schooling her features into composure. Her personal turmoil had no place here. The southern lords and ladies studied her, trying to gauge whether the Wolf Queen held more sway than she let on. At length, Lady Nemella resumed, describing how storms off the coast of Dorne had delayed shipments of citrus and other produce, causing spoilage before it reached King's Landing. Arya and Aegon asked pointed questions, searching for a solution that wouldn't incite more friction between Dornish captains and crown officials. Hours slipped by in a barrage of proposals, counters, and potential treaties. By the time the sun hovered low over Blackwater Bay, the envoys departed to their guest chambers, leaving behind a flurry of parchment on the table. Aegon pressed his palms against his eyes, as if warding off a headache. Arya stacked the scrolls, her mind still churning with the day's details. Over the past months, they had grown used to this routine, navigating the labyrinth of alliances from dawn till dusk. She pushed a cup of spiced wine toward him, and he took it with a grateful exhale. "Long day," he muttered. "Sometimes I question whether the realm is too large to truly unify, and then I remind myself that letting it splinter would cause even more chaos." She understood the sentiment. The Seven Kingdoms were not merely lines on a map. They were patchworks of pride, culture, and old grudges. She sat across from him, swirling the wine in her cup. "At least the Dornish are willing to talk," she said quietly. "That's more than we could say a decade ago. Prince Dorne tried to keep the peace in his time, and maybe some of that is still carrying forward." Aegon nodded. "Yes, but any misstep, and the fragile trust breaks." His gaze flickered to her. "You handled them well today," offering suggestions that seemed both fair and firm. "It reminded me of your counsel about dealing with the rebels in the Reach. You're quick to see the heart of a dispute." She wasn't sure if it was a compliment or a polite statement of fact, but she answered with a faint shrug. "It's nothing special. My father taught me to consider the perspective of all parties before making judgments. He used to say that swift justice can be blind if you haven't looked at every side." He looked at her curiously. "It's an interesting tension, though. You also don't hesitate to act when the need arises. You proved that with the infiltration in the dungeons, and again when you rode out to quell that mercenary band." He set his cup down, the ring of Valyrian steel on his finger catching the last of the daylight. "There's a duality in you. You're both measured and ruthless. People wonder how they should approach you." She took a sip of her wine, letting the warmth settle in her chest. "Perhaps that's useful, if it keeps them from thinking I'm predictable," she said. She studied him for a moment, recalling how once he'd seemed like nothing but a potential threat to her family. Now they shared the burdens of governance and had arrived at a kind of partnership. And in that observation, she glimpsed her own transformation. He gave a small smile, though it looked tinged with weariness. Indeed, rising from his seat, he stretched his shoulders and walked to the window. The amber glow of the setting sun painted the bay in shimmering golds and reds. "There's something I need to discuss," he said without turning around. "John Connington has sent word that the roving outlaws in the stormlands are growing bolder. They attacked another small caravan near Haystack Hall. The local garrison drove them off, but the region is growing wary. It seems we need another show of force." He finally looked over his shoulder. "I wanted to ask if you'd travel there as an envoy of the crown." Arya's brows lifted. She had traveled south before on crown business, but the Stormlands had its own complexities. "What would you have me do?" she asked. "Negotiate with the local lords? Hunt the outlaws?" "A bit of both," Aegon answered. "Many of the Stormlord bannermen still harbor suspicion of me, given the Baratheon claim. If you go, they might see it as a more neutral approach, Stark blood rather than Targaryen alone. And your reputation precedes you. The outlaws might think twice if they know the Wolf Queen is coming. Besides, you're better suited than most to dealing with cunning threats." Her mind raced through the possibilities. She weighed the risks. Leaving King's Landing meant stepping away from the heart of the crown's power, but it also allowed her freedom of movement. She could gather intelligence on how the southern lords truly felt about Aegon. Perhaps she could glean alliances or detect brewing conspiracies that remained hidden in the capital. And if a direct conflict arose with these outlaws, she wouldn't mind crossing swords again. She realized she was almost eager for the chance to be out of the Red Keep's stifling environment. "All right," she said. "I'll go." With a small entourage, so as not to alarm them into hiding. He nodded, relief flickering in his posture. "We can arrange the details in the morning. I'll send a raven ahead to announce your arrival. Be careful, though. The stormlands can be as treacherous as its weather." She offered a wry smile. "I'll manage." Rising to her feet, she gathered the parchments with a quick efficiency. She caught him watching her, an unreadable expression on his face, perhaps concern or something deeper that they had not yet named between them. She dipped her head slightly in acknowledgement, then moved to leave, but his voice stopped her at the threshold. "Arya," he said softly. "Thank you." She paused, casting a glance over her shoulder. The warm glow of dusk silhouetted him against the window, turning his silver-gold hair into a halo of light. "We both want the same thing," she replied. "A realm that doesn't devour itself, and a north that stays safe." She left him there, letting her footsteps echo in the corridor. A swirl of conflicting emotions followed her: gratitude, a small thread of growing fondness, and the sense of a looming challenge that beckoned her beyond the city walls. She spent the next 2 days making preparations. She selected a retinue of northern guards whose loyalty she trusted implicitly, along with a handful of experienced crown soldiers who knew the lay of the land in the stormlands. Not wanting to draw too much attention, she limited the group to fewer than 20. Each man and woman chosen had shown skill in scouting and fighting, as well as discretion. Lady Tiora Haraway raised a brow at this quiet mustering of troops, but Arya gave her no explanations. Let the curious speculate. The fewer people who knew her true objectives, the better. Before she departed, she sent a coded raven to Sansa in Winterfell, informing her of the plan. The message was couched in innocuous language about visiting a windy place to sniff out the approach of storms. But Arya trusted Sansa would decode the hint. It was essential that the North remain abreast of any developments that might affect their security. Even now, alliances could shift like sand in a storm, and she refused to leave her sister blind to events in the south. On the morning of their departure, the sky was a flat gray, threatening rain. Arya donned practical leathers beneath a heavier traveling cloak embroidered with the direwolf sigil. She strapped Needle at her hip, feeling more at ease than she ever did in the courtly dresses. In the courtyard, her small company was assembled, horses saddled and laden with supplies. She noticed the stable hands glancing at her in curiosity, for the queen rarely rode out in such a modest force. Let them wonder, she thought, adjusting her gloves. A few courtiers lingered to watch, including Lady Tiora, who hovered near one of the side entrances like a black crow, as though hoping to pick at some scrap of gossip. Arya ignored her. Aegon appeared at the top of the courtyard steps, flanked by a pair of Kingsguard. He descended, nodding to the men in Arya's retinue. When he reached her, he spoke quietly, so only she could hear. "I've given John Connington instructions to support you however he can. Ravens will be sent to Storm's End as well, to ensure the Castellan there cooperates if you need a base." She nodded. "Anything else I should know?" He hesitated, as though wrestling with whether to say something. Then, with a measured breath, he said, "There's a rumor circulating that some of the outlaws might be ex-soldiers who fought for Stannis Baratheon during the war. Men who never laid down their arms after the battles ended. If that's true, they could be well-trained. Do not underestimate them." Arya's jaw tightened. "I won't." For an instant, she thought he might lean in and press some gesture of farewell. A clasp of the hand, a light touch, but they were surrounded by onlookers, and such intimacy was not a luxury they often indulged. Instead, he simply stepped back, offering a dignified inclinati. On of his head, she mounted her horse, took the reins, and signaled her companions to follow. They rode out under the watchful gaze of the Red Keep's guards, crossing the city gates into the broader realm that sprawled south and east. The journey to the stormlands took several days at a brisk pace. Rain greeted them often, and the roads grew muddy, slowing their progress. Along the way, they passed small villages where peasants stood huddled under crude shelters, eyeing the royal party with caution. Arya observed the conditions: fields battered by wind, livestock looking half-starved. Winter's approach was harsher here than she had anticipated, and she wondered how they fared with limited harvests. One evening, while they made camp near a copse of twisted pines, she spoke with her soldiers about distribution of grain. The northern men had seen the north's well-managed stockpiles. Perhaps this trip would yield knowledge on how the stormlands might replicate that careful preparation. Or perhaps they were too battered by old battles to have recovered. When they finally neared Haystack Hall, the castle that had been the site of a recent outlaw attack, Arya took stock of her surroundings. The stormlands lived up to its name. Ominous clouds rolled overhead, and gusts of wind threatened to unseat any rider who wasn't careful. The land was rugged, dotted with jagged hills and dense, wind-blown forests. If outlaws hid there, they would be difficult to root out. Still, Arya felt a spark of anticipation for a more direct challenge than petty court intrigues. At the gates of Haystack Hall, they were met by a wary group of guards. Upon seeing the royal banners, the guards quickly ushered them inside, hurrying to inform Lord Errol, an elderly man who had inherited the keep after a cousin's untimely death. Inside the main hall, the torches sputtered in the draft, throwing dancing shadows on the walls. Arya was shown to the Lord's Solar, where she found Lord Errol seated by a meager fire, clutching a walking stick. "Your Grace," he said, rising stiffly to bow. "I wish I could offer a grander welcome." She inclined her head. "Thank you for receiving us. I understand you've had trouble with outlaws on your lands." Lord Errol replied, grimacing. "They raid the smaller villages, especially along the Old Stags Road. They struck a caravan last week, killed 2 men, made off with everything of value. My men tried to hunt them down, but the scoundrels vanished into the hills." He gestured for Arya to sit, and she took a seat opposite him. He eyed her traveling attire and sword with a mixture of curiosity and relief. "Word is you're here to deal with them." Arya exchanged a look with the captain of her guard, a stalwart man named Ser Roderick Mormont, a distant cousin of the Mormonts of Bear Island. "We're here to investigate," she said, "and if the outlaws can be brought to justice, we'll do so." "Justice?" Lord Errol repeated, as though the word were a hollow shell. "I hope you'll have better luck than we have. They know the terrain. We rarely get more than a glimpse of them." Arya asked him for all the information he had. Numbers, known hideouts, any local rumors about a leader. He admitted that local gossip claimed a man called the Red Bull led the band, so named for a battered sigil that might have been an old Baratheon crest. Arya noted the possibility that this Red Bull was a leftover soldier from Stannis's campaigns. She thanked the Lord for his cooperation and arranged for her party to lodge in the castle's outbuildings. Before turning in for the night, she walked the battlements, scanning the rolling hills under the moonlit sky. A chill breeze whipped her cloak around her ankles. She thought of the north's crisp air and the biting wind off the bay at Winterfell. A part of her missed it, yearned for the clarity of those cold nights. At dawn, she gathered her guard and a small troop of Lord Errol's men. They rode out to the site of the most recent attack, a narrow stretch of road flanked by rocky slopes. The ground was churned with hoofprints and wagon ruts, some half obscured by the rains. Arya dismounted, crouching to study the tracks. She recalled the lessons she'd learned from the Hound about reading the ground, spotting signs of how many men might have passed, how fresh the marks were. Ser Roderick joined her, pointing to a scattering of footprints that veered off into the underbrush. They followed the trail, forging deeper into the hills. Twice, they lost the tracks to rocky terrain, but Arya had a knack for spotting bent grass or disturbed stones, a lingering skill from her travels across Westeros. Progress was slow. She instructed the group to remain quiet, for fear of alerting potential sentries. Eventually, they reached a wooded ravine, where the canopy of twisted oaks shielded them from the worst of the wind. Ser Roderick signaled for a halt. In the distance, Arya thought she saw a curl of smoke rising between the trees. They dismounted, tethering the horses to low branches. With practiced stealth, they spread out. Arya took point, needle in hand, every sense on high alert. The underbrush was thick, catching at her boots. She pressed forward, step by careful step. The closer she got, the stronger the smell of burning wood became. At last, she peeked over a small ridge. Below lay a crude encampment, a scattering of tents and a makeshift fire pit, around which half a dozen men lounged, their armor mismatched and rusted in places. She noticed a ragged banner hanging from a spear, a faded charging stag, once black on gold but now muddy with grime, overlaid with what looked like a crude painted bull's head. It was indeed a twisted echo of Baratheon heraldry. The men at the fire laughed raucously, passing a jug of something between them. A few more figures moved near the tents. Arya counted 8, perhaps 9 in total. She signaled to her companions with a silent hand gesture, letting them know the approximate number. The plan was simple. If these truly were the outlaws terrorizing the roads, they would be taken swiftly, hopefully without too much bloodshed. Arya slipped down the ridge first, using the cover of brush to move into position. She saw Ser Roderick and 2 others on the opposite side, ready to close in. A twig snapped under her foot, and one of the outlaws glanced in her direction. She froze, pressing herself against a trunk. He stared for a moment, his brows furrowing. Then, shrugging, he turned back to his companions. Arya exhaled quietly. They had a chance. At her signal, her guard lunged from the foliage in unison. A swift wave of steel and shouts. Arya darted forward, needle at the ready, focusing on the man closest to her. A burly figure with a patchy beard. He fumbled for his sword, eyes wide with shock. Arya slashed upward to knock his blade aside, then delivered a precise thrust. He stumbled back, cursing, blood blooming on his tunic. Another outlaw scrambled for a spear, but Ser Roderick collided with him, sending him sprawling into the fire. Screams erupted, mingling with the clang of steel. An arrow whistled past Arya's ear, burying itself in a tree trunk. She ducked behind a battered crate. One of the outlaws, an archer perched behind a tent, was knocking another arrow, aiming at Ser Roderick. Arya seized a knife from her belt and hurled it in a single fluid motion. The blade struck the archer's shoulder, making him yelp and drop the bow. She dashed across the clearing, finishing him with a quick strike of needle. Chaos reigned for a full minute before the outlaws realized they were overwhelmed. A few tried to flee into the trees, but the rest of Arya's men flanked them. The clearing smelled of blood and smoke. At last, those still standing threw down their weapons, some dropping to their knees and pleading for mercy. Arya surveyed the aftermath. 3 outlaws lay dead, 2 wounded, and 4 taken alive. One of her guards had a deep gash on his arm, but he seemed stable. Carefully, she wiped Needle's blade on a scrap of cloth, her heart pounding in her ears. Even after all these years, the rush of battle triggered a primal instinct in her, a mixture of cold focus and that old savage spark. "Who leads you?" she demanded, scanning the battered, frightened men. "Where is the one called the Red Bull?" None answered at first, exchanging nervous glances. One eventually spat on the ground, sneering. A small, wiry outlaw with a fresh cut on his cheek said, "He ain't here. He's gone west to muster more men. You'll never find him." Arya stepped forward, pressing Needle's point against the man's throat. She saw recognition flicker in his eyes as he realized who she was. No mere soldier, but the Wolf Queen. "I can be very persistent," she said icily. "Tell me where to look. Now." He swallowed, sweat beading on his brow. Hammerwatch Ridge," he stammered. "Northwest of here. He said he was going to meet some lords who might fund us. I don't know which ones, I swear." She studied his terrified gaze. She believed he didn't know. Carefully, she withdrew her sword and turned to Ser Roderick. "Bind them. We'll take them to Haystack Hall. Lord Errol can keep them in his dungeons until the king decides their fate." Her gaze swept over the ragged outlaws. "As for the Red Bull, I'll find him myself." They secured the prisoners, collected anything of value from the camp, and set fire to the tents. Smoke billowed, a warning to any who might come back. Arya took a moment to confirm the wounded on both sides, providing what first aid they could. In the aftermath, a quiet tension lingered among her men. They had succeeded here, but the real threat, the rumored leader, remained at large, possibly forging alliances with hidden lords who still resented Targaryen rule. As they led the prisoners away, Arya's thoughts churned. Which lords might be foolish or desperate enough to sponsor a band of outlaws? The possibilities made her uneasy. Upon returning to Haystack Hall, they secured the prisoners with Lord Errol's guards. The old lord seemed both surprised and relieved by Arya's swift action. Over a meal in the castle's dim hall, she questioned the outlaw who had given the clue about Hammerwatch Ridge, pressing him for more details. How far, which roads, any landmarks. The man's answers were vague, but enough to form a rough plan. Arya decided she would depart at first light to intercept this Red Bull if possible. That night, she lay in a modest guest chamber, listening to the wind whip through the castle's shutters. She felt the old, familiar restlessness that came when a mission was incomplete. She rose, lighting a small candle, and spread out a map on the wooden table. Hammerwatch Ridge lay some leagues northwest, near a tangled forest that extended toward the borders of the Reach. If the Red Bull was truly meeting with potential allies, it might be a secret gathering. She would need stealth to catch them unawares. Studying the topography, she traced possible routes on the map, her mind shifting into the methodical calm she had honed during her time as a faceless man. A plan began to take shape. She would travel with only a handful of her most skilled fighters, leaving the rest behind to guard the roads. Speed and surprise would be her weapons. She let her finger rest on the mark for Hammerwatch Ridge, recalling the outlaw's trembling voice. Who were these lords so eager to fan the embers of rebellion? If they were simply disgruntled stormlords, it might be containable. But if their influence spread beyond the stormlands, the threat could grow. She thought of Aegon in King's Landing, weighed down by the precarious negotiations with Dorne. Would the crown be forced to fight yet another rebellion? Could the realm endure another large-scale conflict after all it had suffered? A rustle outside her door made her tense. She blew out the candle, rising to her feet, one hand on the hilt of needle. After a moment's silence, she cracked the door open. The corridor was empty, lit only by a single torch on the far wall. A shadow flickered at the corner, and she eased out, glancing around. No one. Had it been a draft or the distant swirl of someone passing by? Her instincts told her to be cautious. She ghosted down the hall, silent on the flagstones. At a corner, she peered around and saw a figure moving near the stairs leading to the courtyard. Narrowing her eyes, she recognized Ser Garam, one of Lord Errol's knights. He was heading out in a hurry, cloak pulled tight around him. Something about his furtive manner raised her suspicions. She debated confronting him directly. Instead, she followed, letting the shadows swallow her presence. Ser Garam slipped through the side door into the courtyard. The wind battered at the torches there, casting dancing lights across the stables and wall. Arya kept her distance, creeping from cover to cover as he walked to the far side, where a small postern gate led out. To her surprise, a slender figure waited, hooded. She couldn't see the face, but Garam began speaking in low tones, the words lost in the gale. She watched the interplay of gestures, his urgent hands, the figure's nods. After a minute, the hooded figure handed him a folded parchment. Garam tucked it into his cloak and whispered something else, then turned to go back into the castle. The hooded figure slipped out the postern gate into the night. Arya pressed herself against the wall, waiting until he passed. His footsteps echoed on the cobblestones, retreating toward the keep's interior. On impulse, she darted after the hooded stranger, slipping through the postern gate before it latched shut. Outside, the darkness pressed close, the wind howling. She scanned the narrow lane beyond the castle walls but saw no sign of the figure. She moved quickly, searching for footprints in the mud. A few prints were visible, leading away toward a cluster of trees. She followed, heart-pounding. This was the kind of chase she had once relished, tracking a quarry through the night. The footprints led into a thicket of thorny undergrowth. Branches snagged at her sleeves, slowing her down. 100 paces in, she lost the trail. She paused, breathing lightly, straining her ears for any sign of movement. But the night offered no clue. Whoever that figure was, they knew the terrain well enough to vanish. She let out a silent curse, then carefully retraced her steps to the postern gate. The cold metal handle rattled. Locked, she sighed, scanning the wall. The fortifications here were old and crumbling in places. A half-broken ladder lay nearby. She tested it. It seemed sturdy enough. She climbed it to the top of the wall, swinging over and landing softly on the parapet. Then she slipped back into the courtyard, mindful of any watchers. She returned to her chamber undetected. There, she allowed herself a moment to process what she'd witnessed. Ser Garam receiving a secret note from a mysterious stranger could be innocent. Perhaps he was exchanging letters with a lover. But the hush, the tension, and the timing suggested otherwise. She suspected conspiracy. If Ser Garam was funneling information to someone beyond the walls, it might be about her presence, or the presence of the outlaws. She thought of the parchment he tucked away, wondering if it was a missive about the next raid or a warning that the Wolf Queen was on the hunt. Exhaustion tugged at her, but her mind churned with possibilities. Sleep would be uneasy. She decided to confront Ser Garam in the morning, quietly, to see if she could glean the truth without arousing suspicion. If it turned out he was in league with the outlaws or their hidden sponsors, Lord Errol needed to know. Yet she must tread carefully. Any open accusation might spook the conspirators and send them deeper into hiding. She needed proof, or at least some semblance of certainty, before exposing this new thread of intrigue. Dawn came with a stinging rain and low, leaden clouds. Over a hurried breakfast, Arya gathered Ser Roderick and a few of her men, informing them of what she'd seen. She instructed them to keep an eye on Ser Garam discreetly while she prepared to depart for Hammerwatch Ridge. Ser Roderick frowned, calling Garam a loyal knight, but Arya insisted that loyalty could be an illusion. She told them to remain vigilant, in case Garam made another suspicious move. She left behind most of her retinue at Haystack Hall, deciding to take only 4 men with her to the ridge. If the outlaws or their potential allies were gathering, a small group would stand a better chance of slipping in unnoticed. Lord Errol protested that it was too dangerous for a queen, but Arya waved off his concern, reminding him that she had navigated more perilous scenarios than this. She spotted Ser Garam in the yard, watching them mount up. His expression was carefully neutral. Perhaps he was simply curious. Perhaps he was something more. As they rode out, Arya felt his gaze linger on her back like a prickling brand. The journey northward was miserable under the pounding rain, the horses plodding through mud that sucked at their hooves. Her small party pressed on, navigating winding roads that soon gave way to rough, forested terrain. Every so often, they paused to check for tracks or signs of travelers, but the downpour made it nearly impossible to find fresh traces. A swirl of tension coiled in Arya's stomach. If the Red Bull and his contacts were meeting in secret, they might be well hidden by the storm. They camped that night in a sheltered hollow beneath a rocky overhang. The wind howled overhead, sending water cascading down the edges of their makeshift refuge. One of the soldiers, a crown man named Orwyn, managed to coax a small fire to life. They huddled around it, cloaks drawn tight, sipping at watered wine and gnawing on dried meat. It reminded Arya of her younger days, traveling with the Hound or with Gendry and Hot Pie, except now she was the one making decisions, guiding the course of the group's mission. She felt the weight of the crown's expectations on her shoulders, even out here in the wilderness. She was no longer just Arya Stark with a stolen sword. She was the Wolf Queen on a hunt for potential traitors. Morning found the storm past, leaving the world soaked and glistening. A thin fog clung to the undergrowth. They set out at first light, forging deeper into the hills. By midday, they glimpsed Hammerwatch Ridge, a long, undulating rise crowned with a stony outcrop. From a distance, it looked barren, just scrub and boulders. But as they drew closer, Arya spotted a cluster of weathered ruins near the top, what might once have been a small holdfast or watchtower centuries past. She dismounted and signaled her men to do the same. The group proceeded cautiously on foot, hugging the tree line for cover. They climbed a narrow ravine that cut into the side of the ridge, careful to move quietly. At the halfway point, Arya motioned for them to halt. She had heard something, a faint clang of metal carried on the light breeze. Dropping low, she crept forward until she could see beyond a bend. Sure enough, two men stood guard near an archway of crumbling stone that led into the ruins. They wore mismatched armor and carried spears, scanning the vicinity with bored expressions. Beyond them, Arya glimpsed at least 3 horses tied to a makeshift hitching post, alongside a wagon. She exchanged glances with her men. This was no random wilderness camp. It looked more organized. They pulled back to a safer vantage, crouching behind a large boulder. Ser Roderick spoke in a low whisper. "We can ambush those guards, but if there are more inside, the alarm will be raised." Arya considered the options. A direct assault might catch them off guard, but also risk airing off anyone of importance. Perhaps they could create a distraction. "We need to see if there's another way in," she said. "We'll circle around, try to get on higher ground." They retreated into the thick brush, making a wide loop around the ridge. The climb was arduous, the ground slippery from rain. After half an hour, they emerged onto a ledge overlooking the ruins. From there, they could see the partial remains of stone walls encircling a courtyard-like space. A handful of tents had been erected, and a larger pavilion stood at the center. Arya counted a dozen men milling about, tending a small fire, checking gear. Some wore partial mail, others leather jerkins. She saw the faint glint of a bull's head emblem on a makeshift banner. Then her breath caught when she spotted a figure standing near the pavilion entrance. A tall man in better armor than the rest, a breastplate with a stylized bull's head hammered into it. His hair was the color of copper, and even from this distance, she could see the scar that ran down his left cheek. He radiated an air of command, gesturing forcefully as he spoke to someone inside the pavilion. She guessed he was the Red Bull. Her eyes shifted to the man he was speaking to, a slender figure in noble attire. The man's face was partially concealed by the angle, but Arya noticed the fine cut of his cloak and the crest embroidered on the edge. Her pulse quickened as she recognized House Cairn's Nightingale sigil. If that was Lord Bryce Cairn or one of his close kin, it confirmed that local nobility was colluding with outlaws. She cursed under her breath. This was precisely the sort of alliance that could destabilize the Stormlands, and by extension the entire realm. They needed proof. She signaled for her men to stay low. Creeping along the ledge, she found a precarious path that led to a portion of the upper wall. The stone there was half crumpled, forming a slope of rubble. If she could get closer, she might overhear the conversation. Carefully, she tested her footing on a loose slab, wincing as a few small rocks tumbled. She paused, heart pounding. No alarm came from below. Inch by inch, she descended until she was pressed against the remains of the wall, close enough to catch snatches of conversation drifting up from the courtyard. "The men can be ready by next moon," the Red Bull was saying, his voice carrying a confident sneer. "We only need your gold and a safe route. If we strike near Storm's End, we can draw out the crown soldiers, then slip around to the Rosby roads." The other voice, belonging to the Cairn noble, sounded anxious. "Too risky. If the king's men catch wind, we'll hang. I want reassurances." "You'll have them," growled the Red Bull. "Trust me." The crowns stretched thin. They're busy pandering to Dorne. And the Wolf Queen is only one woman, no matter her reputation. Arya ground her teeth at that, resisting the urge to leap down and show him just how formidable one woman could be. She stayed still, hoping to hear more. Lord Cairn exhaled loudly. "Fine, but we must ensure other houses are on board. Tarly may join us if we promise him lands near the Blackwater. He still resents the Targaryen forces who seized his holdfast after the war." "That's your realm, not mine," the Red Bull replied. Gather whomever you want. I'll handle the men and the raids. We strike soon, or we lose momentum." Arya clenched her fists, anger brimming in her chest. This was bigger than a mere gang of outlaws. These were disaffected lords plotting open rebellion, aided by mercenaries. If Sam Tarly's house was implicated, though Sam himself was likely in the Citadel or traveling, leaving some other relative in charge, that meant the conspiracy could reach deeper into the Reach. She had to act. But if she attacked now, the conspirators might scatter, leaving her uncertain how far the plot extended. She needed at least one of them alive, preferably the Karen noble, to testify to the crown about the scope of the plan. She motioned for Ser Roderick to move in with the rest, pointing out the vantage for an ambush. They carefully positioned themselves, splitting into two pairs to approach from different angles. Arya remained perched on the rubble, waiting for the opportune moment. She watched as the Red Bull laughed and clapped the Karen man on the shoulder, as though sealing their alliance with camaraderie. One of the outlaws below began fiddling with a battered horn, possibly an alarm device. There was no time to lose. Arya raised a hand, signaled, and her men sprang from their hiding places with war cries. The courtyard erupted into chaos. Arrows flew from one side, forcing the outlaws to dive for cover. Arya seized the moment, leaping off the rubble. She landed on a slope of loose stones, sliding down with needle drawn. Adrenaline surged in her veins, lending her steps the lethal grace of a faceless assassin. The first outlaw to confront her swung a mace wildly. She ducked under it, driving needle into his abdomen. He collapsed with a groan. She stepped over him, spotting the Red Bull barking orders near the pavilion. From the corner of her eye, she saw the Karen noble trying to mount a horse. She sprinted toward him, weaving past a clash of steel between Ser Roderick and another outlaw. The noble climbed into the saddle, panic in his eyes. Arya cut him off, slashing at the horse's flank just enough to startle it. The beast reared with a squeal. The noble tumbled from the saddle, landing hard on his back. Before he could scramble away, Arya was upon him, needle's point at his throat. "Stay down if you want to live," she snapped. He froze, staring up at her in terror. She glanced around, making sure no one was about to strike her from behind. The courtyard was a maelstrom of fighting, but her men seemed to have the advantage of surprise. She turned back to the noble. "Your name?" she demanded. He swallowed hard. "Ser Kevin Karen," he stammered. I only—" "Silence," Arya hissed, pressing the blade closer to his skin. "You'll answer for your treason. Move and I'll see you gagged." She shifted her attention to the rest of the skirmish. The Red Bull, scowling furiously, had engaged two of Arya's men at once. He handled his sword with seasoned skill, parrying blow after blow. Another outlaw tried to charge at Arya, but Ser Roderick intervened, tackling him to the ground. One of the outlaws reached for the horn to sound an alarm, but an arrow from Orwyn caught him in the chest, dropping him where he stood. The Red Bull roared in defiance, swinging his long sword in a brutal arc that knocked one soldier off balance. Then he made a dash for the gap in the ruined wall. Arya cursed, glancing at the man pinned under her sword. If she left him, he might vanish or attack from behind. She looked over her shoulder. "Roderick," she called. "Take him." Ser Roderick rushed over, clamping a gauntlet hand on Ser Kevin Karen's collar. Arya sprang to her feet, racing after the Red Bull. He vaulted over debris, disappearing into the ruins' half-collapsed corridor. She followed in swift pursuit, heart hammering. The corridor was dark, strewn with rubble and broken timber. She slowed, mindful of an ambush, and stepped lightly. A rustle behind a fallen beam alerted her. She darted aside as the Red Bull lunged, sword slicing the air where she'd been a heartbeat before. He snarled, eyes wild with desperation. He was taller than her by a head and wore a heavier breastplate, but Arya had speed and cunning. She dodged his next swing, dancing out of range. In the cramped space, his larger sword was at a disadvantage if she stayed close. She feinted left, then darted in, needle aimed for the gap at his shoulder. He twisted, partially blocking with a metal vambrace. Her blade scraped across steel, sending sparks flying. He countered with a vicious slash. She sidestepped, the blow carving into rotten wood. Gritting his teeth, he pressed forward, hammering at her defenses with brute force. Arya retreated a step, letting him believe he was driving her back. When he raised his sword for an overhead strike, she lunged inside his guard, slamming her elbow into his wrist. The sword clattered to the ground. With a snarl, he grabbed her cloak, yanking her off balance. She stumbled, nearly losing her grip on Needle. He tried to draw a dagger from his belt, but she twisted free of his hold. In a fluid motion, she slashed across the back of his knee. He bellowed, collapsing onto one leg. Blood trickled down his calf, staining the tattered breeches. Panting, he glared up at her with unbridled hatred. She leveled Needle at his throat. "Surrender," she said, voice cold. His lips curled in a sneer. "We don't kneel to false kings." She saw the shift in his eyes. A decision made. He lunged, dagger raised. Arya reacted instantly, driving Needle forward. The point pierced his chest, slipping between the plates of his armor. He gasped, the dagger falling from his hand. For a moment they locked gazes. Then his eyes glazed, and he slumped to the ground, motionless. Arya stood there, breathing hard, Needle buried in his corpse. She tugged it free, wiping the blade on his cloak. Even as she did, a wave of grim acceptance washed over her. He had made his choice. Outside, the sounds of fighting had died down. When Arya emerged, she found the courtyard littered with bodies. Outlaws for the most part, along with two of her own men lying still in pools of blood. Her stomach clenched at the sight. She knelt to check them, but there was no saving either. A bitter pang gnawed at her. She forced herself to stand, to be the leader they needed. The few remaining outlaws were either dead or captured, and Ser Kevin Karen was bound by the wrists, guarded by Ser Roderick and Orwyn. Ser Kevin was pale, trembling. He was a younger man than she'd expected, perhaps in his late 20s. His eyes darted from her gore-stained sword to the battered corpses. "Please, he began. "Save it," Arya growled. "You'll speak your treason before the king himself." She met Ser Roderick's eyes. "We'll take him back to Haystack Hall, and from there to King's Landing." She let her gaze flicker over the bodies. "Search the camp. Gather any letters, anything that might link him to others. Then burn the remains of this nest." They wasted no time. Orwyn discovered a small chest in the pavilion containing a handful of parchments. Hastily scrawled missives about supply requests, lists of men and wages. One bore a sigil she didn't recognize immediately, some minor house's emblem from the Reach, perhaps. Another page referenced a potential ally named Haraway, which made Arya's eyes narrow. Could Lady Tiora Haraway be involved? Or was it some distant branch of that house? The name weighed on her mind. She suspected Tiora's hostility was more than mere pettiness. This might confirm her role in a broader conspiracy, or implicate someone of her kin. Once they had what they needed, they set the camp alight. Fire ate through the tents, turning them to blackened scraps. They laid the bodies of the outlaws in a pyre, offering them a final measure of dignity rather than leaving them to rot. Then, with their prisoner in tow, they rode away from Hammerwatch Ridge. The mood among Arya's men was grim, overshadowed by the loss of their comrades. She felt a pang of responsibility, though she knew each man had chosen to come on this mission. Leading meant accepting the blood spilled for her orders. They reached Haystack Hall by dusk, battered and exhausted. Lord Errol listened in shock as Arya recounted the skirmish, the evidence of treason, the role of Ser Kevin Karen. The old lord agreed to hold Karen under heavy guard. Arya wanted to take him to King's Landing immediately, but the horses were spent, and her own men needed rest. She decided they would depart at first light, praying that no more conspirators tried to free him under cover of night. As she climbed the stairs to her chamber, she noticed Ser Garam lurking in a corner of the corridor, eyes darting away when she met his gaze. She made a mental note to question him as soon as she was assured the prisoner was secure. For now, she wanted only a moment to unburden herself of the day's violence. Her limbs felt leaden, and her mind buzzed with the revelations they had uncovered. House Karen's involvement, references to the Reach, the possible mention of Haraway. The conspiracy was larger than a single band of outlaws. She had enough proof to confront Aegon with the dire truth. These rebels were forging alliances in multiple regions, preparing to mount a coordinated rebellion. If they succeeded, Westeros might be plunged into yet another devastating war. She pushed open the door to her chamber and found it dark, save for the faint glow of embers in the fireplace. She lit a candle, letting the flickering light dance along the walls. She removed her cloak and gloves, then peeled off the stained leathers, wincing at bruises she'd barely noticed in the heat of battle. Exhaustion tugged at her body and soul, yet she also felt that familiar pulse of determination, the part of her that refused to back down from a challenge. She would see this plot exposed, and she would crush it before it blossomed into open warfare. An hour later, she was still awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind moan through the cracks. Her thoughts drifted unexpectedly to Gendry. She pictured him in King's Landing, forging steel for the crown, oblivious to the swirling conspiracies that threatened to tear the realm apart. A small, unbidden wish arose, that she could be a mere traveler again, sitting by a fire with him, free of titles and armies. But that life was gone. She was the Wolf Queen, wedded to the Targaryen king, committed to the North's security. Even if her heart sometimes yearned for simpler bonds, she had to stay the course. In the small hours of the night, she finally slipped into a restless sleep. Her dreams were a tangled tapestry of faces. Ned Stark, Sansa, the Red Bull's sneering visage, Gendry's gaze, Aegon's measured stare. She awoke before dawn with her pulse racing, the memory of a sword fight clinging to her mind. Taking a deep breath, she rose and readied herself. There was work to be done. By first light, Arya had assembled her soldiers for the return journey to King's Landing. Ser Kevin Karen, bound and bruised, was placed under close watch. She confronted Ser Garam at the stables, catching him alone as he prepared a horse. His eyes widened at her approach. She pinned him with a look. "I saw you last night," she said evenly, accepting a message from a stranger outside the castle. "Why?" He tried to bluster. "My lady, that was a personal matter. It concerns." "Don't lie," she snapped, stepping closer. "If you're carrying messages for the outlaws or for conspirators, I will find out." Beads of sweat appeared on his brow. It's not what you think. I have no love for outlaws, but a friend of mine wanted updates on the prisoner's fate. My friend's brother was killed by those bandits, and he wishes to see justice done. That's all." Arya studied him, searching for signs of deceit. His voice trembled, and she couldn't be certain if the fear was genuine or feigned. "Then you won't mind me searching your quarters," she said. "If I find any incriminating letters, you'll face charges of treason." He blanched but nodded. "Search all you like. You'll find nothing but a grieving man's letters." She stared him down a moment longer. Something still felt off, but she lacked tangible proof. "Very well. I'll keep an eye on you. If you prove me wrong, so be it. But if you mislead me—" He swallowed, bowing his head. "Understood." She left him, turning to oversee the final arrangements. Soon, they rode out with Karen tied to his saddle, flanked by guards. The sky threatened another downpour, wind whipping at their cloaks. As they set a steady pace back toward the Crownlands, Arya's mind teemed with strategies for how best to present this threat to the king. She had testimony from Karen, written evidence from the outlaws' camp, but she needed to be sure the crown acted quickly and decisively. The realm was not yet fully at peace. Old grudges and claims still lingered like embers waiting to spark. She intended to stamp them out. The journey took longer than she liked, as they detoured around flooded roads. On the third day out from Haystack Hall, they encountered a traveling peddler who recognized the crown's sigil. He informed them that more bandit attacks had been reported near the Windwater. Arya's jaw tightened. It seemed the rebellion was not isolated. Still, she pressed on, urging her party to make haste. They needed to get Karen before the king as soon as possible. She refused to lose their prisoner to any ambush. At last, King's Landing came into view, its sprawling walls and dense rooftops like a great beast hugging the shore. Smoke from countless chimneys blurred the horizon. The Red Keep's towers rose above the city, a crimson silhouette against the cloud-laden sky. Arya felt a strange mixture of relief and tension at the sight. Relief to be back in the seat of power, tension because she knew what was coming next. The conspiracy threatened to unravel all the tenuous alliances Aegon had struggled to maintain. War might be on the horizon unless they could crush the treachery swiftly. They entered the city amid curious stares. The small folk made way for the column of riders, some murmuring the Wolf Queen, others peering fearfully at the bound prisoner. Word traveled fast in King's Landing. By the time they reached the Red Keep's gates, a small crowd had gathered. Gold cloaks stepped in to maintain order, their faces set in grim lines. Arya rode at the head of the group, ignoring the stench of the city and the swell of onlookers. Karen hung his head, as if hoping to avoid recognition. Inside the keep, Aegon's steward came rushing to greet them. "Your Grace," he gasped, eyes flicking to the prisoner. "The king is in the throne room, hearing petitions." "Shall I?" "Clear the hall," Arya said curtly. "We need a private audience. Now." The steward bowed hurriedly and scurried off. Arya dismounted, trusting her men to handle Karen. She noticed that her arrival had drawn the attention of many courtiers. Lady Tiora Haraway stood in the shadows of a colonnade, her gaze fixed on the prisoner. Arya saw the flicker of alarm cross the older woman's face. So she recognized him, or recognized the significance of it. Arya stored that reaction away for later use. Soon enough, a pair of Kingsguard escorted them into the throne room. Aegon was on the Iron Throne, dressed in his formal attire, black tunic with subtle red embroidery, the Targaryen three-headed dragon pinned at his shoulder. When Arya entered, a flicker of surprise crossed his features. He rose, gesturing for the nearby petitioners to step aside. "Clear the chamber," he commanded. "We'll resume after." The high, vaulted space emptied quickly, the last echoes of shuffling feet dying away. Soon, only Arya, Aegon, a handful of guards, and Ser Kevin Karen remained. Ser Roderick and the other men arrayed themselves around the prisoner, who looked pale and exhausted. Aegon descended from the throne, eyes sweeping over Karen's bonds. "What is this about?" he asked, voice tight with concern. Arya wasted no time. "This man is Ser Kevin Karen of House Karen," she said. "We caught him conspiring with a band of outlaws in the Stormlands, led by a man calling himself the Red Bull. They planned to launch raids, gather disaffected lords, and potentially move against your reign. I have written evidence and a confession waiting to be extracted." Aegon's gaze darkened, flicking to Caro. "And is this true?" he demanded, stepping closer. "You would stir rebellion in the Stormlands?" Ser Kevin trembled visibly. I was coerced," he said, voice shaking. "They threatened my family. I never intended to raise arms against the crown. It was desperation." Arya folded her arms. "He was meeting with them willingly, offering gold and alliances. He has knowledge of others in league with them. Let him speak the names." Aegon turned a cold stare on Karen. "You will speak," he said, "and if your words save the realm from bloodshed, perhaps your life can be spared." Carrying the parchments they had found, Arya offered them to the king. He unrolled them, scanning the contents, his expression growing bleaker by the moment. When he reached the page referencing the name Haraway, his jaw tightened. He looked up, meeting Arya's gaze. It was all she could do not to blurt out her suspicions. That might wait for a more discreet moment. "Lock him in the dungeons," Aegon commanded the guards. "Summon the Master of Whisperers and the Hand at once. We'll have a formal interrogation." Ser Kevin's protests were cut short as the guards dragged him away. A tense silence followed. Aegon exhaled, handing the parchments back to Arya. "I feared pockets of rebellion," he said quietly, "but not an organized plot across multiple houses. I'll call an emergency council session. We have to act before this can spread." Arya nodded. We also need to see who in your court might be involved. The outlaws had references to, well, names that point to certain southern houses. If we can flush them out now, we might avoid a full-scale revolt. Aegon grimaced, running a hand through his hair. Very well. You've done your duty, Arya. Again, you've proven your worth to the crown. I only wish it did not come at the cost of more death. She offered no reply, for there was nothing else to say. Death and duty had become constants in her life. She stepped back, letting him marshal his thoughts. Outside the throne room's high windows, the sky was turning the color of steel. Storms loomed on every horizon. Winter storms, political storms, the swirl of rebellion. Arya stood beside Aegon, the Wolf Queen in a den of dragons, determined to ensure that no matter what chaos erupted, the North would endure. The rest of that day blurred with furious activity. Aegon convened the small council in a locked chamber, summoning Jon Connington, Lady Connington, and the Master of Whisperers, a sharp-eyed man named Brian Waters, rumored to be a bastard of a Targaryen cousin. They pored over the evidence, the parchments, and Arya's testimony about the bandit camp and Ser Kevin Cairn's admissions. Whispers spread through the Red Keep that a new threat had surfaced, prompting anxious speculation among courtiers. Arya, aware of prying ears, said little beyond what was essential, though inwardly she burned to name Lady Tiora Harroway as a suspect. She wanted more proof first. If the note about Harroway referred to someone else in that family, or if Tiora was indeed the culprit, Arya needed to be sure she did not tip their hand too soon. That evening, a wave of arrests began. Aegon ordered the Gold Cloaks to apprehend any minor lords or knights in the city rumored to be affiliated with the conspirators. Some tried to flee, but the city gates were locked down. The labyrinth of King's Landing became a trap. Word came that a few had managed to vanish into the masses of the slums, but the bulk were taken. Meanwhile, Ser Kevin Cairn was hauled to the dungeons and questioned under the watch of the King's Hand. Arya did not attend the interrogation. She had no stomach for such formal brutality. Instead, she waited, restless, for the results. By midnight, Jon Connington emerged with a list of names, a confession extracted after hours of threats, and, Arya suspected, pain. House Tarly was implicated, as well as certain disgruntled knights from the Reach and the Stormlands. Even a scion of House Mutun in the Riverlands was named, though it was unclear how deeply he was involved. Aegon convened Arya and the Hand in his private solar, where candlelight flickered against the gloom. He pored over the confession, lines creasing his forehead. "This is half the realm," he muttered darkly, though it was an exaggeration born of frustration. "We can't just arrest entire houses. We need to isolate the ringleaders." Jon Connington spoke in a gravelly voice. "Ser Kevin claims they plan to strike at Crown convoys along the Rosby Road, drawing out our forces, then seize strategic holdfasts while we were stretched thin. The question is, who was orchestrating all of this from King's Landing? That's the central node." Arya was about to mention her suspicions of Tiora Harroway when there was a soft knock on the solar door. A steward entered, bowing. "Your Grace, the Wolf Queen's presence is requested in the courtyard. There's an arrival from the north." She and Aegon exchanged baffled looks. It was near midnight. Who would travel from the north at such an hour? Setting aside the conspiracies for a moment, Arya followed the steward downstairs to the courtyard, flanked by 2 guards. The courtyard was lit by a handful of torches, the air cold and still. She saw a line of northern riders, their cloaks dusted with road grime. At their head stood a figure with auburn hair bound in a loose braid, face pale from the journey. Sansa. Arya's heart lurched at the sight of her sister. Sansa dismounted, her cheeks flushed from the chill. Nearby, a pair of northern guards helped a second rider who was clearly wounded. Arya rushed forward, her eyes darting over Sansa's face. "What happened?" she asked, voice taut with alarm. Sansa's gaze was haunted. "The tensions in the north have flared again," she said quietly. "One of our bannermen's convoys was attacked on the road from White Harbor. At first, we thought it was mere bandits, but there were signs. House Tarly banners." She exchanged a grim look with Arya. I came to warn you. The conspiracy is spreading north, or at least their mercenaries are. We can't stand by while the realm is dragged into another war. Arya felt a mix of dread and resolve coil in her gut. So the tendrils of rebellion reached as far as the neck or beyond. Come inside, she said, voice tight. We have much to discuss. The king has uncovered pieces of a plot as well. Sansa nodded, fatigue etched in her features. Arya beckoned a servant to see to Sansa's men, ordering hot meals and beds. Together, the Stark sisters entered the Red Keep, the flicker of torches illuminating their path through the corridors. Despite the swirl of urgent matters, Arya felt a small swell of relief to have Sansa by her side again. They might be far from Winterfell, surrounded by southern intrigues, but they were still Starks. Once they had both lost so much to the cruelty of these halls. Now they returned as women wielding a power of their own, determined not to let Westeros fall into chaos again. In a private chamber they conferred, sharing what each knew. Sansa listened intently as Arya recounted her discoveries in the Stormlands, the captivity of Ser Kevin Karen, the infiltration of other houses, and the swirling suspicion around House Harroway. In turn, Sansa described how northern scouts had encountered men bearing Tarly's sigil near the borders, threatening caravans and demanding taxes in the name of a so-called true king. Sansa had left the north in the capable hands of her bannermen, but she had come personally, suspecting a realm-wide threat that required cooperation with the crown. At length, Sansa sat back, pressing a hand to her temple. We must present a united front, she said. If this rebellion gains momentum, the North will be forced to mobilize. We cannot let that happen unless it's absolutely necessary. Arya nodded. I'll speak with Aegon about a coordinated plan. We can't wait for the conspirators to strike first. The mention of Aegon made Arya glance at Sansa, recalling the last time they'd all been together. She wondered what Sansa thought of the king now, whether she believed he could hold the realm together. Sansa's expression was calm, but that calm carried the weight of years spent learning the intricacies of power. They spoke late into the night, mapping out possibilities. Arya could sense Sansa's exhaustion, so she arranged for her to have the best guest chamber available, ignoring the courtiers who might gossip. Sansa was Lady of Winterfell, after all. That outranked any petty southern rumor. Before dawn, Arya met with Aegon in a small library alcove near the council chambers. She had not slept. Neither had he, judging by the circles under his eyes. A single lamp cast trembling light on the books lining the shelves. She explained Sansa's arrival, the situation in the north, the presence of Tarly's men near their borders. Aegon listened, his jaw set in a grim line. Samwell Tarly was once a friend to our family through the wars, he mused, recalling that Sam had been close to Jon Snow and others. But House Tarly, Randall Tarly, was a fierce supporter of the Tyrells and later allied with Cersei. Now it seems they're stoking new flames. He rubbed his temples. We have to quell this quickly. If the North is forced to muster, it'll be a repeat of the old tragedies. Arya's heart twisted. She remembered the War of the Five Kings, the havoc it had wreaked on the small folk, the countless deaths. We can't let that happen, she said softly. This rebellion thrives on regional resentments. We have to root it out at its source. Sansa will help. We should coordinate with the loyal lords in the Reach, like House Tyrell's remnants or smaller houses that still support the crown. We can corner House Tarly diplomatically or militarily if they refuse to stand down. Aegon nodded. And House Harroway? He asked the question quietly, his gaze flicking to her. You suspect Tiora, don't you? The name on one of those parchments is more than coincidence. Arya inhaled. I do. She's always had a certain malice toward me, but that alone isn't proof. We need a more direct link. She paused, recalling the note from the outlaws that mentioned Harroway. We could set a trap. Feed false information, see if it leaks to the rebels. If it does, we'll know the source. He considered it, a slow nod forming. That might work. I'll have the Master of Whisperers handle the details. In the meantime, you and Sansa can rally the North's readiness without openly declaring hostility. Show that we stand together so potential rebels hesitate. A faint flicker of relief passed through Arya. The gravity of the situation weighed heavily, but she appreciated that Aegon was no fool. He understood the precarious nature of these alliances. "We'll do it," she said, "and if any of these traitors try to strike at us in the capital, they'll find we're not so easily cornered." He looked at her with the hint of a tired smile, admiration in his eyes. "The wolf and the dragon," he murmured as if to himself. "Let them see how strong we can be together." They parted to set these plans in motion. Over the next few days, the Red Keep turned into a hive of covert activity. Sansa conferred with Aegon and Jon Connington, forging a plan to reassure northern lords that the crown was addressing the threat. Arya worked with Brian Waters to plant misinformation about a fictitious supply convoy traveling near Rosby, hoping it would lure out any conspirators in King's Landing who might try to tip off the rebels. Meanwhile, the captured lords and knights were questioned one by one. Some maintained their innocence, others raged about Targaryen oppression, and a few broke under pressure to name accomplices. The atmosphere in the keep was tense, corridors buzzing with rumors. Lady Tiora Haraway kept a notably low profile, seldom appearing at court. Arya instructed a small band of her northern guards to watch Tiora's movements discreetly. In the swirl of these maneuvers, Arya caught only glimpses of Gendry. Word spread that he was forging additional arms for the increased patrols. She saw him once in the courtyard, hauling a crate of newly forged spearheads, his hair sweat-soaked from the heat of the smithy. They shared a fleeting glance. She felt that old pang, remembering simpler days. But duty pulled her away, 100 obligations demanding her attention. She silently wished him well and pushed those thoughts aside. On the fourth night after Sansa's arrival, a coded raven arrived from White Harbor, detailing that more mercenaries wearing Tarly colors had been sighted near the neck. Arya brought the letter to Sansa, reading it by candlelight in Sansa's chamber. The flicker of the candle made shadows dance on the walls as Sansa's eyes skimmed the parchment. "They're testing our defenses," Sansa said softly. "If they push any farther, the North will not stand idle." Arya nodded grimly. "We need to strike at House Tarly's seat and bring them to heel before they can spread their influence further. But that means war in the Reach unless they yield willingly." Sansa set the letter aside, folding her hands on the table. "Does the Crown have enough loyal forces in the Reach to move against Tarly swiftly?" Arya considered. "House Tyrell has been diminished, but there are loyal bannermen still. House Redwine, House Rowan. If Aegon can secure their support, we might avoid a long campaign. Alternatively, we could present House Tarly with an ultimatum: surrender the rebels and reaffirm loyalty, or face the combined might of the Crown and the North." Sansa's gaze hardened. "We should do it quickly, before any more damage is done." They rose at first light, ready to bring this plan to the king. In the council chambers, the mood was sober. Aegon listened to their proposal, an ultimatum delivered directly to Horn Hill, with the Crown's forces ready to march if Tarly refused. Jon Connington agreed, though he suggested the Crown must also address the stormlands simultaneously, lest new outlaws rise to fill the vacuum. The debate lasted hours, culminating in a consensus. A royal envoy would travel to Horn Hill with a formal demand for Tarly's submission, while armies mustered in the Crownlands. Arya volunteered to lead the envoy. Sansa offered to remain in King's Landing to coordinate the flow of northern support if war broke out. Aegon did not like sending Arya again into harm's way, but the council recognized she was uniquely suited to confront rebellious lords. Her reputation for ferocity preceded her. As they finalized details, the Master of Whisperers entered with a measured gait, delivering an urgent message to Aegon. The king's face darkened as he read it. "The trap we set," he said quietly. "It worked. Someone leaked word of that fake Rosby convoy. We captured 2 men trying to leave the city with a pigeon for the rebels. They named Lady Tiora Haraway as the one who paid them." A hush fell over the chamber. Arya felt a swell of vindication. She had suspected Tiora. Jon Connington's mouth tightened. "Then it's time we deal with her." Aegon nodded grimly. "Have her brought here, at once." Within an hour, Lady Tiora was escorted into the council chamber by a quartet of gold cloaks. Her face was pale, her eyes flashing with anger. "This is outrageous," she declared. "I've served the crown faithfully." "On whose authority?" Arya cut her off. "We know about the messages you sent to the outlaws. We have 2 men in the dungeons who name you as their patron." Tiora's lips curled. 2 men who would say anything to save their miserable lives. "You have no real proof." "I am a lady of standing." Aegon regarded her coldly. "We have enough to charge you with treason. You can speak in your defense at your trial. Take her away." Tiora stiffened, haughtiness giving way to fear. "You'll regret this," she spat, her voice trembling. "The realm will see this for what it is. Another Targaryen purge of those who speak the truth." Arya felt a dark flicker of satisfaction as the guards dragged her out. The Wolf Queen had no sympathy left for those who would plunge the kingdom into bloodshed. Let Tiora protest. The conspirators could no longer hide, and their network would soon unravel. Over the next 2 days, the Red Keep bustled with final preparations for Arya's mission to Horn Hill. Horses and soldiers were readied, ravens sent to friendly houses in the Reach to coordinate. The plan was simple but perilous. Arrive at Horn Hill, present the ultimatum. If Tarly refused, Arya would have to retreat swiftly and unleash the crown's wrath. A part of her dreaded the potential for slaughter. She knew what war did to the common folk. But there seemed little choice. The conspirators had forced their hand. Before leaving, she and Sansa spent a quiet hour in the Godswood, discussing how the North might respond if open conflict ignited. Sansa promised that if the war escalated, she would ensure the North was ready, yet also do everything possible to find a diplomatic path. Arya thanked her, grateful for her sister's steady wisdom. Finally, the morning came for her departure. The wind was cold off Blackwater Bay, the sky streaked with clouds. Her retinue gathered in the courtyard, a mix of crown soldiers, northern guards, and a few knights from the Reach who had sworn loyalty to Aegon. They would ride under both the direwolf and the Targaryen banners, a symbol of unity. Aegon stood by her horse, tension in his features. "Be careful," he said quietly, meeting her eyes. "If Tarly is as entrenched as we fear, he may try to capture you." Arya inclined her head. "I'll keep my wits about me, and if things go ill, you'll know quickly enough." She placed a hand on the pommel of her saddle. "One way or another will force his hand." He exhaled, clearly wanting to say more. They locked gazes, a moment of unspoken understanding passing between them. She knew he worried for her safety. He knew she would not relent from this mission. Without further ceremony, she mounted up, turning to her assembled party. "Forward," she commanded. The courtyard gates opened, and they rode out into the city, the clang of hooves echoing on cobblestone. As they passed through King's Landing's main thoroughfare, small folk paused to watch. Whispers followed them, rumors of war and rebellion swirling. Arya kept her shoulders square, her expression set. She wore a dark cloak lined with wolf fur, needle at her hip, and a dagger hidden beneath her sleeve. She was determined to do everything in her power to prevent the realm from sliding back into the bloodshed she had witnessed as a child. But she was also prepared to fight, to protect the North and the Crown's fragile unity. They cleared the city gates, riding out onto the King's Road that stretched south and west toward the Reach. The wind carried the sense of damp earth and distant farmland. Soldiers tightened their grips on reins, minds already anticipating confrontation. In the midst of them, Arya felt a swirl of emotions, memories of the countless roads she had traveled, the countless lives she had lived. But above all, she felt a driving purpose. She had married into the crown to protect her family and her home. Now the time had come to see that vow tested against the ambitions of lords who refused to let the Seven Kingdoms heal. As the city dwindled behind them, Arya let out a slow breath. Winter was creeping ever closer, yet it was not the cold that threatened them now, but human greed and old wounds. She rode at the head of the column, a resolute figure in wolf's fur, determined to ensure that this fragile peace did not shatter. The North was with her. The king stood behind her. Her sister waited, ready to guide the realm. With wisdom if war came, Arya Stark, Queen Arya Targaryen, pressed onward, balanced between the shadow of her past and the burning demands of her present. If the conspirators believed the Wolf Queen could be cowed, they would learn how wrong they were. And if the realm demanded more blood before peace was won, she would once again wield her blade, determined that this time, at least, the Starks would not be left broken in the aftermath. She urged her horse into a faster canter, the banners snapping behind her in the wind. The road beckoned, a winding path through the heart of a kingdom on the brink. She had spied on the crown from within, once upon a time, uncertain of her place. Now, she carried the crown's mandate with a fierce certainty of purpose. Whatever the cost, she would not allow the Seven Kingdoms to descend into chaos again. She was the Wolf Queen, after all, and winter or war, rebellion or ruin, she would face it as she always had, blade in hand, heart resolute, unyielding in her duty to protect those she loved.